Dear friends, honorable guests, I would like to thank each and every one of you for your participation on this important day. This year, our conference is being held online due to the coronavirus pandemic. And nearly 1,000 points are connected and follow this conference online. This is a joint committee of NCRI and the British Committee for Free Iran. I am also delighted and honored that Mrs. Rajavi, President-elect of the National Council of Resistance of Iran, is also present at this conference. On International Women's Day, we always talk about the problems, the violence, oppression women are suffering, especially in Iran. However, today, in a short time that I have, I would like to talk about the Iranian women's hopes, their tireless efforts for achieving equality and freedom. With their active presence in all protests and uprising, Iranian women and girls cause fear and panic among the mullahs. They have played a decisive role in all uprising with their presence. Either our sisters who were martyred under savage torture or were hanged, or our sisters who are resisting as a political prisoners in the regime's prison. Some of them have been held captive and tortured for more than 10 years, and the regime did not give them a single day of furlough, even amid the pandemic. They are even deprived of visiting their children and seeing their growth. Nevertheless, they continue their resistance and do not surrender to the regime, while many people do not know them. Let's applaud them. I also want to speak about the mujahideen and defiant women who have been fighting against Iran's misogynist regime for 4 decades. Many have been martyrs, and the rest have continued their struggle. Their bodies were wounded and tortured, but their spirits remained strong. They experienced exile successively, suffered medical sieges, and endured rocket attacks and bombardments, but have always been committed to their people's resistance and freedom. Those martyrs and prisoners and these struggling women are the real heroines of human rights and women's rights. Because we all know that freedom and equality are the only answers to all the problems that Iranian society faces, from poverty and discrimination to deprivation of the rights to choose freely. Therefore, we in the Iranian resistance are determined to achieve these two, namely freedom and equality. On International Women's Day, I would also like to emphasize it is an honor that there is a movement in the world at the forefront of the struggle for democratic change in Iran. And the woman is leading this global movement for regime change and the establishment of freedom and democracy for the Iranian people. She is Maryam Rajavi, whose names and presence have been a political, social, cultural, and ideological challenge to the ruling mullahs. She is an inspiration for me and all the women who are resisting the mullahs' misogynist regime. She is the one who leads a revolution of hope and removes every weakness and despair with her miraculous message. We can and we must. Indeed, the freedom of Iranian people will be achieved with such determination. I can say a lot about this, but I'm not going to keep you waiting longer. I invite dear Baroness Verma, who's been a real supporter of the Iranian resistance during difficult times, to chair the conference. Thanks once again to dear guests and all the participants. Thank you very much.
Thank you, my dear sister. And dear sisters, ladies and gentlemen, it is an honor to speak on this online conference on International Women's Day today, to celebrate this very historic day for us all women throughout the world. So please allow me to greet each and every one of you who are connected today on this online conference, and to all of those who hear my voice anywhere in the world, and particularly to my sisters, the women of Iran. A very happy International Women's Day. The International Women's Day campaign for 2021 is Choose to Challenge. A challenged world is an alert world. We can all choose to challenge and call out gender bias and inequality. We can all choose to seek out and celebrate women's achievements. Collectively, we can all help to create an inclusive world. All of this as we battle against the COVID globally, where women have been disproportionately impacted. And that's why it is important that this conference brings us all together, men and women, to see the challenges already being faced by the women and girls in Iran against a global pandemic. And with this theme in mind for International Women's Day, let me tell you how privileged I feel to be with you to address women who have already chosen to challenge by being at the forefront of the battle. Yes, I am talking about my sisters in the Iranian resistance movement, those who embody a huge capacity of women shouldering the most difficult tasks and for taking the highest risks to liberate all Iranian women who are suffering under gender apartheid and for so long have prevailed under the cleric regime, standing up against misogyny, speaking out against oppression, and fighting for equality. These women are capable of doing this because they have learned to liberate themselves under gender apartheid. They have put themselves above and before everyone else to make sure that they are the voice to be heard. They have put aside the self-disbelief that many women in our world are accustomed to and have taken on the highest and most serious responsibilities at decision-making within the resistance. For decades, their persistence, they have sent a clear message to the Iranian regime and the mullahs. The situation for women in Iran is unacceptable. Women have chosen to challenge, and they will not give up until Iran is free. Despite the problems, the misfortunes of the Iranian people under such a dictatorship that is hard to bear, and with such bravery, women in the Iranian resistance have fought hard for the future of Iranian women and Iran. These women, who are now the role models for millions of Iranian women, have a role model much brighter, much braver for them to adopt to. It is my honor and my privilege to introduce our keynote speaker. She is a woman of extraordinary courage, supported by women of extraordinary courage, who has chosen to challenge decades ago. She's a woman remarkable, with perseverance, with honesty and selflessness. She has been an inspiration to not just all Iranians, but to women across the world who are yearning for freedom, for human rights, for democracy, for social justice, and most importantly, for gender equality. Under her leadership, women in the Iranian resistance, those whom I've described a few moments ago, have not only achieved gender parity, they occupy the leading positions of this most democratic movement, which spans from Iran to Europe, to the United States, and of course to Ashraf III in Albania. My ladies and gentlemen, my dearest sisters, please join me in welcoming our dearest sister, the great inspirational figure, a great leader, Mrs. Maryam Rajavi, the President-elect of the National Council of the Resistance of Iran, who will join us shortly online. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Baroness Verma, for your strong speech. The Right Honourable Baroness Verma, distinguished members of the British Parliament, women's rights advocates, dear friends and sisters. On behalf of the Iranian people and resistance, I extend my warmest congratulations on International Women's Day, and I salute all women who have fought and sacrificed for the cause of equality. I pay tribute to these struggles' pioneers, great women such as Bertie Albrecht, Clara Zetkin, and Olympe de Gouges. Women's struggle and sacrifice have been and are the foundations of progress and the guarantee for democracy in our world. Therefore, a world without injustice, oppression, fundamentalism, and poverty depends on women's struggle. This year, International Women's Day coincides with the coronavirus pandemic. Within Iran, the people are extremely dissatisfied. The uprising on the 22nd of February by the people of Sistan and Baluchistan reflects Iranian society's increasing confrontation with the ruling regime. The people of Iran yearn for freedom, democracy, and justice. The Iranian people are deprived of the most basic necessities, such as water, bread, hygiene, and healthcare. Nevertheless, the mullahs are working to build nuclear weapons and ballistic missiles and continue their criminal meddling in the Middle East. Our sisters across Iran are the primary victims of COVID-19 because of economic pressures and the pressures in the family. Of course, they have the greatest motivation to encourage uprisings against the regime. So this year, International Women's Day carries a commitment for Iranian women, namely that we can and we must secure the victory of freedom and equality amid disease, oppression, and poverty. Dear friends, the outcome of the significant gender gap in Iran is extreme poverty imposed on women. For example, presently nurses endure great hardships in attending to the sick, but most receive a salary of 20 million riyals or $80 per month. Based on government figures, more than 60,000 nurses were infected with COVID-19 last year. Families, of course, families force their young daughters into marriage because of poverty. In fact, the regime's reactionary laws sanction this ominous conduct. A Justice Ministry official revealed that there are between 500,000 and 600,000 child brides every year. Dear friends, discrimination and barbaric oppression are essential to the mullah's outlook and policies. The arrest of women in the streets continues as it is a vital part of the campaign to control society and impose repression. The number of women executed during Rouhani's term has reached 114, making the regime the world record holder in executing women. Last month, during an en masse hanging in Gohardash prison, west of Tehran, one of the victims, Zahra Ismaili, a mother of two, died from a heart attack after seeing 16 others hanged before she was. Nevertheless, the henchmen still hanged her dead body. Her lawyer told this story afterward. The misogynist regime preserved its rule through repression. However, Iranian women play critical roles in challenging the regime and pushing for the regime's overthrow. Women are the prime victims of the regime. Therefore, they have greater motivation to end this regime. In 5 nationwide uprisings, Iranian women posed the greatest challenge to the regime. They have demonstrated their capacity in setting up resistance units, and they play a pivotal role in the organized resistance movement. Iranian women have shouldered the responsibility to end the catastrophe caused by the ruling theocracy and are prepared to make it happen. Dear friends, we seek to establish a pluralist republic based on human rights, a republic based on the separation of church and state. We want to realize a genuine democracy in which women's active and equal participation in political leadership is necessary. In tomorrow's Iran, all women's individual rights will be recognized, including their freedom of belief, religion, employment, and travel. Women are free to choose their own dress. In tomorrow's Iran, men and women will achieve total parity. Any form of compulsion against women in the family will be banned. Women's equal rights to divorce will be recognized. Physical, sexual, and psychological violence against women in the workplace, educational centers, household, or anywhere else will be regarded a crime. Any sexual exploitation of women under any pretext will be prohibited. The mullahs' Sharia laws will have no place in tomorrow's Iran. All international agreements on the rights and freedom of women, including the Convention to eliminate all forms of discrimination against women, will be at the front and center of civil laws. The trampling of women's rights is the most flagrant aspect of the elimination of the human rights of the Iranian people by the ruling mullahs. Therefore, all those concerned about the threats posed by the regime to the international community must support Iranian women's resistance. Dear friends, efforts to contain and control the regime's nuclear program will not succeed unless they are coupled with firmness against violations of the human rights of the people of Iran. Call on your government to make economic and political ties with the criminal Mullah regime conditional open respect for human rights in Iran, especially women's rights and prisoners' rights. There is a long line of women who are resisting in prisons across Iran. And although there is not much talk of them, but they are among the most resistance fighters for human rights. In the name of the equality movement, I urge all advocates of gender equality across the world to support the arising women of Iran and the Iranian people's uprising for freedom. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, Madam Rajavi, my dearest sister. As always, you have given us such inspirational words. And there are many people here to speak today from parliaments from across the globe and other organizations. And it is a great pleasure to be chairing this part of the meeting. I would like to turn to one of those contributors today, and that is Baroness Harris of Richmond, a former Deputy Speaker of the House of Lords and a Liberal Democrat member of the House of Lords. She came into the House of Lords in 1999 and has been on a number of committees and organizations, and she has great experience in the work across the police authorities in the UK and the NHS Trust. If I may ask Baroness Harris of Richmond.
On this very special International Women's Day, I send you, Mrs. Rajavi, and also all the women in Ashraf 3, my very warmest greetings. And I thank you for all that you're doing for your country in bringing sense, compassion, bravery, and humanity into the darkness that is Iran today. We know how appallingly women there are treated, and we stand in solidarity with you as you fight the tyranny of the mullahs. You stand at the forefront of the battle for human rights and for a fair, free, and democratic country, following Mrs. Rajavi's 10-point plan, which is a blueprint for freedom. We in the West will be watching carefully what happens in the future, and we hope and pray that when we meet again, your lives will be immeasurably better and that you are able to live in peace in your own land at last. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for your inspiring words and your support for the Iranian women's struggle.
Thank you so very much, Baroness Harris of Richmond. If I may, I would now like to invite my friend and colleague, Baroness Eaton. Baroness Eaton has been a former councillor in Bradford. She was chair of the Local Government Association and a strong stalwart for fighting for equality, particularly in the care system.
Dear friends, my dear Iranian sisters, and dear Mrs. Rajavi, it is always an honor to speak and to be part of your events that I have always appreciated, but it's a double honor to speak on the occasion of International Women's Day. My colleague talked about the existence of 27 state agencies in Iran tasked to suppress women specifically, including compulsory veil. Has anyone ever asked why the clerical regime is so desperate to focus its attention on fighting women in every form and shape it can? The mullah's regime that since its inception has executed 120,000 of the best and brightest people, including pregnant women, has indeed institutionalized gender discrimination in law and in practice. Literally speaking, Iran is one of 3 to 4 countries that has taken no action in ratifying the Convention of Elimination of Gender Discrimination. By realizing the misogynist nature of this regime, women took leadership roles to not only fight for their own rights, but to liberate a nation from the darkness of a medieval regime that has rightfully, in my opinion, seen its end at the hands of women. Over the course of my engagement with NCRI, I met many women who had spent time in prison as political prisoners and have seen their relatives and best friends executed, and yet they had endured. A prime example is this Mrs. Rajavi herself, that her younger sister, 8 months pregnant, was attacked by the murderous IRGC agents and killed under torture. I want to use this opportunity to recommend myself to the cause of freedom and equality in Iran, as I firmly believe the regime in Iran is a clear and present danger to our security and to the Iranian people, and in particular, Iranian women. For me, the pain that the mother of Iranian wrestler champion Navid Afkari, who was executed by this regime just a few months ago and endured, is unimaginable. Navid's 2 brothers also are imprisoned. Can any one of you imagine that pain? How about the brave Rehana Jabouari, who did not give in to the criminal agent who wanted to assault her and her grieving mother? How about the frail mother of Sattar Bahashati, a blogger killed under torture by the regime? And the list goes on. My heart goes out to all these suffering women and mothers. In conclusion, what is our role? What should we do? Is it enough just to talk about these atrocities? Or, as entrusted representatives of the people, we have a duty to act? These are my recommendations. 1, any relationship with the regime in Iran, if any, must be contingent upon verifiable human rights improvements, including women's rights. As the main apparatus of suppression inside Iran, an exporter of terror abroad, the IRGC and its affiliated Basif force must be proscribed in its entirety. And I am confident we have a cross-party support for this endeavor. And finally, we have to recognize that NCR is our ally because peace and stability in the volatile region of the Middle East can only be achieved, and more importantly, maintained, when malign activities of the Iranian regime stops. And that can only be achieved by supporting the Iranian people and NCRI for a tolerant, non-nuclear and democratic republic in Iran. Thank you.
Iranian women, and the only way to establish freedom is continuing the struggle against this brutal regime. Thank you very much.
Thank you so very much, Baroness Eaton, and thank you, my dear sister. I now turn to another part of the world. And this is South Africa. And have some remarks from a remarkable young lady, the granddaughter of Nelson Mandela. She is a humanitarian. She shares thoughts on women driving transformation with experience in public relations. May I welcome Miss Dlamini Mandela.
Program Director, Mrs. Rajavi, members of Parliament, my lords, ladies, and gentlemen. It is indeed a pleasure and honor to be invited to talk to you this afternoon on International Women's Day about the struggles that Iranian women are waging against the Islamic regime to secure justice, freedom, democracy, and gender equality. The women of Iran have over the past 40 years been subjected to extreme atrocities for taking principled, brave, and legitimate stands against Islamic Sharia laws of the country. It is indeed paradoxical to imagine that while the Iranian constitution, adopted following the Islamic Revolution in 1979, proclaims equality for men and women under Article 20, the reality is since the revolution, Sharia laws have been used to oppress, subjugate, humiliate, abuse, undermine, and strip the women of Iran their dignity, just like apartheid did to the Black women of South Africa. In 1996, my grandfather, Nelson Mandela, established a gender equity task team headed by Dr. A. Wolpe to look into why girls and women occupy a lower status in our society and the negative effects this has on our development as a country. They produced a report entitled Issues on Gender in Schools, an Introduction for Teachers. The report argued that religion remains one of the most powerful belief systems that is resistant to change. All major religions believe that people are equal in the eyes of God, although the form this takes differs from religion to religion. Yet women find that this equality does not apply to them in their own communities. It is in the way in which communities worship, their interpretations of the religious documents, the Bible, the Quran, the Torah, and so on, and the authority of their leadership that creates this difference. So religious practices do not live up to their religious theories. Why should this be so? A critical point the report highlights with regard to religion is most societies are controlled by men whose practices reflect their power over women. These power relations become reflected in religious practices. Also, the religious writings have been compiled and interpreted by men, reflecting their ideas and their experience. Just like in the fight against apartheid, the Islamic regime finds its toughest enemies among women. Currently, more than 150 notable women feminists are languishing in prison simply because they are demanding equal rights. The women in their struggle against apartheid sacrificed, contributed to ideas, and were often subjected to the same brutal treatment as the men received at the hands of the apartheid government, such as a 90-day detention, house arrest, and exposed to emotional trauma in being banished far from all that was family and their familiars. However vile the state was in the oppression of the women, the South African women refused to capitulate to the onslaught of the apartheid state's systematic brutality. On 9th August 1956, the Women's March took place in Pretoria, South Africa. The march's aims were to protest the introduction of the apartheid pass laws for Black women in 1952. The pass laws were amongst the most draconian laws passed by the nationalist government. The pass laws were a form of internal passport system designed to segregate the population, manage urbanization, and allocate migrant labor. As my grandmother remarked in 1987, there is no longer anything I can fear. There is nothing the government has done to me. There isn't any pain I haven't known. During their struggle against the apartheid state, the rallying cry for the women became, Watinta abafazi, watinta imbogoto. You strike the women, you strike the rock. The banishment of my grandmother, Winnie Madikizela Mandela, to a house in the dusty Afrikaans town of Frankfurt in the Free State, which had no running water, no electricity, no floors, no ceilings, coupled with being subjugated to isolation, loneliness, and above all, dehumanizing brutalization, was in itself soul-destroying torture to my grandmother. I know that over thousands of women have been imprisoned and many lost their lives. My heart weeps for those who have lost their lives fighting for what they have believed in. Based on our submission by Justice for Iran on sexual violence in the Islamic Republic, the October 2013 report by the UN Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women, Professor Rashida Manjoo, to the UN General Assembly, ended the cycle of silence on one of the most traumatic forms of state-sponsored human rights abuse aimed at women in custody in Iran, the raping of virgins prior to execution. As the granddaughter of struggle icon Winnie Mandela, the struggle of the Iranian woman is close to my heart. I witnessed my grandmother, the late Winnie Mandela, stand up to fight against the oppressive apartheid government, tirelessly, relentlessly, with dedication to the Black people of South Africa. She was courageous, she was determined, fearless, and managed to be the mouthpiece for the movement she was committed to. She did it despite constant threats, imprisonment, and banishment for 10 years to a foreign town, where even there she was able to bring change and reform that surprised the very system that thought banishment would silence her. But it incites her even more to stand up for what she believed in. She was also a mother, a wife, and managed to rise against the odds. Many women were killed and risked their lives, but despite, they continued to stand up against the injustice they continually suffered. Winnie was the personification of the steely determination, commitment of the women who stood up to the apartheid state at whatever cost and suffering it brought upon them. My grandfather said, since my release, I have become more convinced than ever that the real makers of history are the ordinary men and women of our country and the world. This is our time to demonstrate and spread the African philosophy of Ubuntu, which means I am because we are. As a global village, we are each responsible to stand up and stand together with the women of Iran in their fight against oppression, dictatorship, injustices, and inequalities. Lastly, I now speak on behalf of all the women who fought, struggled, and suffered to rid South Africa of apartheid. Women of Iran in their fight for freedom, justice, and gender equality. Thank you.
Dear Dlamini Mandela, thank you for participating in this important conference and your inspiring message for the Iranian women. As you know, the Iranian women are suffering a lot from the misogynist regime ruling Iran, and your support means a lot to them. It will send them a strong message that with perseverance, as did your heroic grandfathers, late President Nelson Mandela, victory will arrive. Once again, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you so very much. And what an inspiration. Thank you so very much for those words. And I'm sure that the women, not just only in Iran, but wherever they are oppressed, will be warmly welcoming your words today. Thank you so much. And now if I move on to my colleague from the House of Commons, a new member of Parliament in 2019, a former journalist and later a barrister, a member of the Home Affairs Committee and co-chair of the Women Work or Parliamentary Group. Can I welcome Laura Faris?
Thank you so much. It is truly an honour to join you on International Women's Day. And I also have to say, it's a great honour to be joined by politicians and women's rights activists from many other countries, including our previous speaker. When we celebrate International Women's Day in the UK Parliament, we talk about things like how to get more women into politics, how to get more women at the very top of politics, how to improve women's pay in the workplace so that they earn equivalent salaries to men for the same work, and we talk about how to share the duties in the home fairly between men and women. And when I come and speak at an event like this, I am reminded that for so many women around the world, the struggle for equality has barely even started. And for many, well, for women in Iran, even the most basic human rights are denied to them under the banner of Islamic fundamentalism and religion. And I think about the nature of discrimination that takes place, of the most basic kind, even women not having the right to choose the clothes that they wear, having to seek permission to study or travel or work from their father or their husband, and having to endure still early marriage, child abuse, domestic violence, honor killings, the rights over who they marry. And so today on International Women's Day, it is truly an honor to stand shoulder to shoulder with women in Iran and to speak about how important their human rights are to me, and to not forget that the struggle has only just begun for you. It is also something, and I hope you will understand why I have to say it, that it's a moment to think in the UK about Nazanin Zaghari Ratcliffe, the British national, the British Iranian national, who has just completed her 5-year jail sentence in Tehran. She has a further trial on Sunday, and the outcome of that is not known. And I also think about the story that was told at the beginning of this about Zara Esmaili, who was a victim of domestic abuse, and while waiting for her execution, suffered a heart attack and died, and still she was taken to the gallows and her body was hung even though she'd already died. And I think about her because at 42 she is the same age as me, and like me she has 2 children, and it makes me think very carefully about the difference in the experience of a woman in the United Kingdom and the experience of a woman in Iran today. So on this day, on International Women's Day, we stand in solidarity with Iranian women, particularly those who've stood at the forefront of the protests that have taken place in the last 42 years, especially in 2009, in 2019, where it was particularly brutal, and in 2020, and know that we do follow your progress here, and we do stand up for you in Parliament, and will continue to do so, and we do follow the news of the violence that accompanies women in Iran. So I know that part of this meeting today is for us to, I think, recommit to supporting you, and as members of the UK Parliament to acknowledge our responsibility to make your voices heard through our own foreign and diplomatic channels, and to support the struggle for freedom that today's meeting represents. Thank you.
Laura, thank you for your support and solidarity with the Iranian women. This shows that the representatives of the UK Parliament support the Iranian women's struggle for freedom and democracy. Thank you very much.
Thank you so very much, Laura. And we will hope to see much more of you during all of the conferences that go on. If I now turn to our next speaker, a very eminent member of the House of Lords. He was a former member of the House of Commons for the Liberal Democrat Party, a good friend, and somebody who's such a strong voice for the human rights of people across the globe, Professor Lord David Alton.
I'm pleased to stand with you again today, and especially to give my greetings to Mrs. Maryam Rajavi, whose long struggle for freedom in Iran has been truly heroic. On February the 17th, 2021, in a heinous crime, Zahra Esmaili, a female death row prisoner and mother of two, who died of a heart attack when 16 men were hanged in front of her eyes. Shortly before her execution, she was nonetheless, in a gruesome, barbaric act, hanged in Gohard Hash prison in Karaj. Denying dignity and respect in death, as dignity and respect have been denied in life, is a hallmark of the Iranian regime. Zahra is the third woman to be executed in Iran in less than a month, and the 114th woman to be executed since the so-called moderate government of Rouhani took office. This tragic case describes the appalling situation of women in Iran. They are denied their most basic rights, they have no protection in their own homes, and they can't even choose their own clothing. One of the regime's most overlooked victims are the mothers of Iranian activists who have been cruelly executed, political prisoners and detained activists during the last 40 years, their mothers too, including the 1,500 protesters who were killed in November 2019 when the Supreme Leader ordered the security forces to crush the nationwide popular protests. All of them have mothers. Thousands more protesters were arrested at the time and subjected to cruel torture like waterboarding, flogging, electric shocks, and mock executions. Imagine this was your son, your brother, your husband. On this day, International Women's Day, we lend our voices to these grieving mothers and the family members. Victims of the regime demand justice, and they demand accountability for the officials and leaders in Iran who are responsible for the extrajudicial killings of their children and the use, widespread, of torture and cruelty. And we stand with them. We do so by calling on the United Kingdom government and the European Union governments to impose sanctions on these perpetrators, including the head of the judiciary, Ibrahim Raisi, and the Supreme Leader Khamenei, under their new Magnitsky-style human rights sanction regime, to hold them to account. On February the 20th, with my colleagues in the British Committee for Iran Freedom, we sent a letter to the Foreign Secretary, Dominic Raab, expressing our regret over the government's silence and inaction with regard to Iran's state terrorism, following the conviction of the Iranian diplomat on terrorism charges in Belgium. In our letter, we emphasized that a global Britain must have the courage to take the lead in Europe to address the serious threats of Iran's state terrorism, and we urged the Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office and the government to downgrade diplomatic relations with Iran until such a time that Tehran provides verifiable proof that it has stopped its state terrorism and terrorist activities. We also urged the FCDO and the government to investigate whether Iranian diplomats in the United Kingdom are involved in similar activities. If that is the case, they must be prosecuted and they must be expelled from the United Kingdom. Ultimately, Iran's fate must be determined by the people of Iran. And on this International Women's Day, we recognize and applaud the many brave Iranian women who are at the forefront of the anti-regime protests in Iran in the last 3 years, and who are leading the organized opposition and resistance that is spearheading the struggle for a free and democratic Iran. We know that the NCRI President-elect Maryam Rajavi has presented a democratic alternative to the current theocracy, which is summarized in her 10-point platform for a future Iran. This platform ensures that in the future, leaders are elected by universal suffrage and not selected by a supreme leader. It ensures that in a future Iran, there is gender equality and fundamental rights, including the most basic things, such as choosing your own clothing, but equality before the law, equal participation in political leadership, equality in the economic sphere and within the family and community life. This platform empowers and gives voice to the women in Iran, who constitute almost half of the population. It sets out a viable Iranian solution and offers a roadmap to the people of Iran to achieve their rights, their freedoms, and their democracy. So I call on the United Kingdom government and the international community to recognize the NCRI and its democratic platform for a future Iran, and to support them as the real expression of the democratic aspirations of the Iranian people, and to reach out to the NCRI president-elect, Mrs. Maryam Rajavi, as the representative of the Iranian people in their desire for change, working with her for a free and a democratic Iran.
Thank you, Lord Alton, for your support for the Iranian people and the resistance and their uprisings. The Iranian people, especially women, are encouraged to see that members of the UK Parliament support their struggle. They are determined to put an end to this brutal regime. Thank you very much. Please.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you very much indeed. And we go to another part of our great country, a member of the Irish Parliament from the Fine Gael party, Jennifer Carroll McNeil. Jennifer, if you could kindly give your remarks.
Hello, I'm a member actually of the Irish Parliament, which is an independent parliament founded back in 1921 and indeed 1937. And at its core has always had a very strong commitment to human rights, driven by, in large part, women driving a civil society movement towards women's rights in this country. This jurisdiction, this independent republic, was dogged for many years also by a theocratic regime, given express constitutional preference over every other religion. And its influence reached into our schools, into women's lives, into the lives of children, where we had a background of forced adoptions and a whole range of difficult issues. So we understand in part the impact of a theocratic regime on the people of a country. For us, the Irish, in Ireland, the issue of human rights is extremely important, and it's also a matter of grave concern for myself and my colleagues in the Irish Parliament. I had the pleasure of speaking this afternoon with Minister for Foreign Affairs Simon Coveney, who is the Irish Foreign Minister, and who is also this UN Security Council representative at the moment, working specifically on the Iranian nuclear JCPOA deal at the moment, and who was in Tehran yesterday and over the weekend to talk to the President about that issue. But also he asked me to inform you he had a 3-hour meeting with the Foreign Minister, Minister Zarif, where he raised a whole range of human rights issues. It is an anathema to our Foreign Minister and to our Irish Parliament that there is, for example, no law on domestic violence, that the age of maturity of criminal responsibility for girls in Iran is 9, whereas it's 15 for boys. These are just some of the range of human rights abuses and gender infringements that women suffer and that girls suffer under this regime. And on this day, in International Women's Day, we stand in Ireland in solidarity with the brave Iranian women who have been actively taking part in and standing at the forefront of this anti-regime, of the anti-regime protests over the last 42 years, but in particular in recent years and in these days. So Ireland and the international community stands both in thought and in practice with Iran today, and we support their struggle for freedom and democracy in Iran.
Thank you for your support. As you said, human rights is very important, and the only way is to establish freedom in continuing the struggle against this misogynist regime. Thank you very much.
Thank you so very much, Jennifer. Thank you very much, and apologies for making the slip. I know exactly that the Irish Parliament is separate, but I feel it's so much close to all of us anyway, but forgive me for that error. Now, if I could turn to a dear friend, another part of the world, sharing The work that we are all trying to do is making sure that rights of women are seen globally. She is director for the Center of Social Research in India. She's worked as a senior professional at the United Nations and is amongst the 100 most influential women in gender policy for 2019. I would like to welcome dear friend, Dr. Ranjana Kumari.
Thank you very much for inviting me for this very important conference. On a very special day, International Women's Day, dear Mrs. Rajavi and dear all friends, I would like to salute your brave struggle and your leadership for, freedom of sisters of Iran, people of Iran. I have been part of your journey for a long time now, and I know that when you all are fighting on the streets, cities, all of you courageously for fundamental change in Iran, and when you say that the regime will change, will really give the kind of equality and freedom that women are looking for, I feel so convinced that finally women will get there in your leadership. Also on this day, to the brave sisters of Iranian resistance, the 1,000 women in Ashraf 3, I want to send my salam, my greetings. I join international personalities behind Mrs. Rajavi to ensure your safety and protection. And we finally were victorious to see in the leadership of Mrs. Rajavi that you all safely and collectively relocated. I met and visited you finally after the long battle, and now see you more than ever determined to free Iran. Your determination is source of inspiration to the women of Iran. The Iranian people have never ever accepted the mullah's rule. They have indeed waged the most heroic resistance for 40 years. And we are proud to have been part of it, even in a very, very small way and in our own capacities. But we are with you, with all the power and our hearts and the strength in our will. Thousands of women have sacrificed their lives in the struggle against the dictatorship, and you all have narrated some of those painful stories. And today, a new generation of women have entered the fight and are continuing their path. In the nationwide protests, especially in November 2019, we all witnessed the courage of women, young and old, who took to the streets to protest against this corrupt and misogynist regime. Women's role in the November 2019 protests compelled the regime to acknowledge their role. 400 to 1,500 killed in the protests were women. This figure speaks for itself. Even the regime wrote that Iranian women had a pivotal role in leading the protests and that their role was remarkable. Iranian prisons are packed with political prisoners today who are suffering under intolerable conditions, and we keep getting all those reports in our part of the world. Maryam Rajavi, Montfeld, Fatima Musana, pardon me my pronunciation, but Parastu Moini, and many others. You are not forgotten, and we will continue to campaign for your freedom and release. The brave Iranian women are not only fighting for their own emancipation, but also for the individual freedom of the Iranian people. Their point is that women of all nationalities, religions, and social classes should enjoy equal rights with men in all economic, social, and political contexts. And I think your 10-point program, Mrs. Rajavi, clearly spells out this commitment. Women who have proved they are the force for change in practice and in the toughest social scenes in the battle for the overthrow of a religious fundamentalist dictatorship, and they have obtained the leadership of the uprising of freedom. And I'm confident that it will be these very women of Iran who will defeat the misogynist regime. What Iranian women have been sacrificing for can be summarized in 4 words: freedom, democracy, equality, and emancipation. But where does this courage and leading role come from? The Iranian resistance is led by a woman, you, Mrs. Rajavi, who is the main enemy of the mullahs in Iran. Maryam Rajavi, who is the role model for all women in Iran, who today are calling for change and bright future. And we all get inspired by your leadership, Mrs. Rajavi, and I have said it more than many occasions. So, victory to you, a bright future to all people of Iran, and I shall pray for the victory of your struggle. Until that bright future is realized, you can count on us. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, dear Ranjana Kumari. You are one of the pioneers in defending women's rights, and you are always very active, and I appreciate your support for the women of Iran, and I'm very happy to see you again, and we will continue our struggle together. Thank you very much.
Thank you so very much for that. I was struggling with the unmute button. Thank you very much, Ranjana. As always, very insightful comments for all of us. I now turn to another dear friend and somebody who has been committed for us as long as I think he's been a parliamentarian since 2010. Member of Parliament, Dr. Matthew Offord, who is a member of the Environmental Audit Committee in the House of Commons. Matthew.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction. I appreciate it a great deal. Madam President-elect, friends and colleagues, and our distinguished guests, it's an honor to be speaking to you today on this year's celebration of International Women's Day. I especially wanted to be with you because I believe that women in Iran deserve our support and greater international recognition as they take on and challenge the brutal theocracy in Iran. This is a regime that treats half of its own population, the women, in such an appalling way by depriving them not only of their fundamental rights and freedom, but also of their dignity. It's a regime that cannot be trusted. And I especially wanted to highlight today the case of Nazanin Zaghari Ratcliffe, someone who lives very close to my constituency and has been unjustly imprisoned by the regime. Now she had served her sentence, it was expected that she would be released to leave the country, but no. The regime cannot be trusted, its judiciary cannot be trusted, and the mullahs especially cannot be trusted. But in February, just a month ago, we are reminded that the regime's destabilizing activities are no longer confined within Iran and the Middle East, but has now reached Europe in the form of state terrorism. This has resulted with an Iranian diplomat being sentenced to 20 years in Belgium for a possible or potential terrorist murder, and most of all for plotting an attack on the Iranian resistance gathering in Paris. Several of my colleagues and myself actually attended the conference, and we are very concerned and frankly annoyed that this individual was able to do this. And we continue to press our government to take actions against the regime. Just last week, the NCRI revealed new information about the regime's Abadeh nuclear site, one of the 2 sites in Iran where the nuclear watchdog has found anthropogenic uranium particles. This is according to the latest report by the International Atomic Energy Authority back in February. We know now that the regime has blocked access to these sites to the IAEA inspectors. The regime has not answered the agency's questions relating to the possible presence of nuclear material at these locations. This shows that the UK and the E3 must snap back all UN sanctions and the reinstatement of all 6 previous UN Security Council resolutions against the regime in Tehran. The UK must also work with our European and American allies to refer the regime's human rights violations and terrorist acts to the United Nations Security Council, with the aim of holding those responsible for these atrocities to account in an international tribunal. By coupling human rights, terrorism, and nuclear concerns in this way, the West can address all the serious concerns with the Iranian regime with the same strategy, which is required and was missed last time in the run-up to the 2015 nuclear deal. Furthermore, the international community must press the regime to accept the UN human rights experts visiting Iran and the Iranian prisons to investigate the reported cases of torture and extrajudicial killings and meet with political prisoners and the detained protesters. This is possible if it is pursued with the same determination and firmness with which we pursue IAEA inspections at Iranian nuclear sites. In this regard, I agree with the NCRI President-elect, Mrs. Maryam Rajavi, who said, efforts to contain the regime's nuclear program will not succeed without firmness against violations of the human rights in Iran, the eviction of the regime from the Middle East, and the dismantling of its missiles program. So if we all want to prevent the regime, to stop them from acquiring nuclear weapons, the UK and our allies must first make sure that the women and the Iranian people enjoy their fundamental rights and freedoms instead of offering the regime incentives and sanction relief that only pave Tehran's way to acquire nuclear weapons. We can do this. We've seen today there are many voices strong enough and succinct enough to ensure that the regime is fundamentally changed. And that change will come. Sometimes it seems far away, but I'm sure that one day it will. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Matthew Afford. As you said, and negotiations with the regime must be conditioned to respect for human rights in Iran, and you have always contributed to our events, and this shows your commitment for freedom and democracy. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Offord. Thank you, Matthew, very much for your contribution. I'm slightly struggling with my technology today. So thank you indeed. I will hastily go on to our next speaker for the afternoon, and that is a colleague from the crossbenchers, from the independent benches, Baroness Cox.
President-elect, Mrs. Rajavi, honourable friends and colleagues, thank you for inviting me to celebrate the International Women's Day with you. I want to take this opportunity to express my solidarity with women in Iran who courageously stand up for their rights and their equality. I also want to thank Mrs. Rajavi for her informative and inspirational remarks, explaining the women's struggle and their historic role in the freedom movement in Iran. I'm encouraged to hear your 10-point plan for the future of Iran, which offers a free and democratic Iran that is diametrically opposed to Iran under the current theocratic regime, characterized by repression, misery, and misogyny. By every measure and definition of the word, Iran under the theocratic regime is a gender apartheid. And although different in nature, like the last apartheid in South Africa, there must be a synergy of diplomatic isolation, international pressure, sanctions, and global support for the grassroots movement, and recognition of the resistance movement with its leader. Recognition from the international community if Iranian people, especially women, are to throw the gender apartheid instituted by the theocracy into the dustbin of history. And we know that the leader of this resistance movement is Mrs. Rajavi, whom we have just heard from, and as she explained, women are both leading the opposition and are at the front of the anti-government protests in the country for the last 4 decades. So we in the West and all the international community must stand with them so that women are free to choose their place of residence, their occupation and education. Women in Iran have the right to choose their clothing, to travel freely, choose their spouse, divorce, obtain custody and guardianship over their children. The West and the international community must also pressure the regime and government in Iran to release all political prisoners and dual citizens. This and other human rights improvement should be the minimum condition for any bilateral or trade relations with Iran. These are inalienable rights that are the basis of any functioning and prosperous society. And as we have heard from Mrs. Rajavi, the women of Iran are already committed to the struggle to achieve these rights. The International Women's Day is the day that marks a call to action for accelerating women's equality, according to the official website. Today, it is my privilege to join with other speakers to call on the UK government to act in close cooperation with our allies at the EU and the UN. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Baroness Cox, for your support and your solidarity with the Iranian women. As you said, the international community must put pressure on this misogynist regime. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Baroness Cox. And now it gives me great privilege to hand over to my colleague from the House of Commons, a former Secretary of State for Northern Ireland and also former Secretary of State for the Environment. She will now take over as chair, and I'm sure will also, through her own remarks, give complete support and solidarity to women from across the world, and particularly to our sisters in Iran. But before I do that, I would also like to thank my sister, Sarah Banez, for being the chair of the NCRI Women's Committee. You do such a phenomenal job, and because I may not get an opportunity to say it at any point later on today, I would like to say thank you for all the work you do too. Thank you very much indeed. It gives me great pleasure now to hand over to the Right Honourable Theresa Villiers.
Well, thank you very much, Baroness Verma, for chairing the first part of this conference and for that kind introduction. It's an honour to be part of this important virtual event hosted by the British Committee for Iran Freedom. It's great to be able to celebrate International Women's Day with you. It's an opportunity for me, as so many others have done, to pay tribute to the brave women in Iran and around the world who struggle for equality and challenge misogyny. It's a privilege to share a virtual stage with NCRI President-elect Maryam Rajavi. We all know Mrs. Rajavi shoulders the monumental responsibility of leading the campaign for democratic change and reform in Iran. As we all know, and as many have said at this event, the regime in Tehran has reduced women to second-class citizens. They're prevented from making their own choices on their clothing, their work, their travel, and on so many other aspects of their lives, and they're left vulnerable to the horrors of domestic violence and forced marriage. All of this in addition to brutal curbs on freedom of expression, political dissent and human rights, which the regime imposes on all its citizens, men and women. By contrast, Mrs. Rajavi leads a movement that embraces women's leadership and has a strong focus on empowering women. I very much hope that one day we see a realization of Mrs. Rajavi's ambition that a future generation of girls in Iran will be able not only to pursue happiness and equal opportunities, but also to shape their country's future and see it take its rightful place amongst the free nations of the world. This year's theme for International Women's Day is Choose to Challenge. On the official website for the day, it explains from challenge comes change, so let's all choose to challenge. Not an easy thing to say. From the first day, the mullahs usurped power in Iran by hijacking the revolution 42 years ago. Many women have chosen to challenge the theocratic regime to try to bring about change. Today, the regime faces growing protests and popular dissent, despite all its brutal crackdowns, executions, and mass arrests. And the question for the UK government and the international community is, on which side of history do they want to be? I would strongly encourage the UK government to engage with the NCRI and Mrs. Rajavi and her 10-point plan for democracy, human rights, and equality. Our Foreign Secretary should also work with the EU and international partners to put pressure on the regime to release political prisoners and the unjustly imprisoned dual nationals, especially the women who languish in prison unfairly. And as others have said, any future relationships or agreements with Iran need to be continued contingent on real and verifiable improvements in human rights and women's rights. And I'd also like to see the UK's new Magnitsky sanctions system applied to regime officials and leaders who are responsible for serious human rights violations. Clearly, the mullahs fear the democratic aspirations of Iranian opposition groupings, and they fear the empowerment of Iranian women who want a democratic future for their country. I believe that's why they sent their diplomat to bomb the NCRI gathering in Paris in 2018. I was one of the people at that conference to show solidarity with people in Iran protesting against the regime. I and many elected representatives from around the world attended to support Mrs. Rajavi's platform for a free Iran, where human rights and gender equality are respected. And I'm pleased to be here once again to show my support for the brave women who are campaigning to change Iran for the better and to put their country on the path to freedom. Thank you.
Thank you very much, dear Teresa Villiers. You have always supported our movement, and as a leading woman in the parliament and a prominent Secretary of State in the government, your support is very important and valuable for the Iranian women. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for your kind words. And now I'm delighted to be able to introduce a video clip about women's struggle for freedom in Iran.
Under the ruling misogyny in Iran and the gender apartheid that has prevailed, Iranian women are going through one of the most difficult periods in Iran's history. They are severely suppressed, brutally stoned by the street thugs on the bogus charge of male veiling. They are savagely attacked by hooligans who splash acid on their faces. They are not treated as equal with men in any field, but are equally executed. They suffer from extreme poverty and forced into women's trafficking. But Iranian women have not surrendered despite the mullah's misogynist and oppressive policies and practices. By relying on a glorious history of struggle and resistance for emancipation, a history not disclosed and introduced to the world as it should have been, they have placed a unique role in liberating their country in the old Persia, in the Constitutional Revolution in 1906, in the anti-monarchical revolution in 1979, and in the present struggle against religious dictatorship. Although after the coming to power of Khomeini and the misogynist rulers in Iran, women could not reap the benefits of anti-monarchic revolution in which they played a serious role. They did not surrender and showed that even if it takes decades to achieve liberation, they will fight for it. And thus, they not only valiantly participated in, but also led many of the uprisings and protests nationwide.
سوار نوع دی گزارش های شبکه منتون میگیرم
Iranian women have played an unrivaled role in leading virtually every uprising and protest. They're viewed as vanguards of resistance to liberate Iran from the yoke of the most misogynist and oppressive regime in the world. How is this possible? It is so because Iranian women have found their role models in women in the ranks of the Iranian resistance. That is a generation of women who have assumed the most serious and key leadership roles in the ranks of the Iranian resistance. Over 50% of the NCRI members are women. People's Mujahideen Organization of Iran, the main constituent organization in the National Council of Resistance of Iran, is run by a central council which is made up entirely of women. Women can be observed in all fields, playing key leading roles. Today, the resistant units inside Iran bravely dispel the fear of the people and open the way for defiance and rebellion by different segments of the society. Women have joined many resistant units across the country, and this is a path to victory against dictatorship and misogyny. Women's leadership will make that happen.
Thank you for that video clip. I'm now very honoured to be able to pass over the floor to my colleague Sir David Amis, who is Conservative Member of Parliament for Southend West and of course co-chairman of the British Committee for Iran Freedom. So over to you, David.
Madam Chairman, Madam Rajavi, and all those who are online in this conference to celebrate the International Women's Day, let me start by saying Happy International Women's Day to all women, and especially Iranian women. The truly shocking video that we have just seen really demonstrates at first hand why this conference is so important today. We believe that throughout the world, discrimination exists against women and girls, and it's rampant. And in some countries like Iran, it is in fact getting worse. But we also know that equality for women is progress for all. In that context, the Iranian regime is creating more concern and worries for the world, while the Iranian resistance movement is making the world hopeful with its progress. The clerical regime has an appalling human rights record. It has continued to arbitrarily arrest social and political activists and has been using violent measures to extract forced confessions from prisoners, later using them against them. The conditions of those who have been arrested during the uprising and protests, like the one in November 2019, and the recent one in Sistan Baluchistan, is outrageous. The regime has also continued torture and ill treatment of prisoners, particularly political prisoners and detained protesters, who also include women and young girls. In a shocking report, Trampling Humanity, published in September, Amnesty International revealed horrific accounts of torture and execution against the detained protesters of the 2019 uprising. Amnesty International has investigated the actions of the Iranian authorities against those arrested in connection with the protests and concluded that they committed widespread patterns of serious human rights violations, including arbitrary detention, enforced disappearance, torture, and other ill treatment, and also flagrant breaches of the right to a fair trial. And I urge everyone to read the report that has been done on this. The Iranian regime continued its use of medieval and inhumane punishments in 2020. In September, the regime's judiciary branch in Urmia, northwest Iran, sentenced 4 men to have 4 fingers amputated each. How dreadful. While the IRGC dominates Iran's economy and the regime plunders the national wealth, the regime's judiciary issues harsh sentences for petty crimes such as thievery. The Iranian regime's border forces continued the killing spree against deprived porters who must carry really cruelly heavy loads as the breadwinners of their families. This job is a direct result of the regime's institutionalized corruption and plundering of the national wealth. In other words, poor Iranian porters are under double pressure, poverty and oppression. So it is quite obvious that the clerical regime is at war with Iran's population, both inside and outside Iran. It extends its human rights violations to outside its own borders. One such dreadful case was the Villepinte case near Paris, which was planned to blow up a large gathering of the Iranian resistance. As suggested by the chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee in the United Kingdom Parliament, we need a robust policy vis-a-vis the Iranian regime. The IRGC must be designated. It is time for the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights to set up a commission of inquiry for the 1988 massacre, as well as the carnage during the November 2019 uprising. We should also hold the Iranian authorities accountable for their crimes against humanity. So let us keep ourselves committed to taking these actions, which will definitely put us on the right side of the history. Maryam Rajavi, in the end, let me once again express my full support for your wonderful efforts to bring democracy and human rights back into Iran.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ames. You have explained very well the situation in Iran, and you have always supported our movement against this regime. And as you said, the Iranian regime is a real threat for the peace and security in the world, and its human rights record is terrible. You have always been at the right side of the of the policy, and thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you. Important words, both from Mrs. Rajavi and from Sir David. And our next speaker this afternoon is Jane Dodds, who is the leader of the Liberal Democrats in Wales. Welcome, Jane.
Thank you very much. Madam President-elect, I bring you greetings from Wales. I am delighted to be able to join you and just share a few words of solidarity and support to you all. Today is International Women's Day. We know that the theme is choose to challenge. And we know, and we've heard very clearly, that the flame of feminism is so alive in Iran. Here in Wales, for women, we have our human rights, our freedoms, education and choices for our work. We have education and leisure and sports. And we have our democracy as well. 35% of Welsh women are members of Parliament. And in our Senedd, our Welsh Parliament, 50% are women. However, in Iran, we know how underrepresented women are in positions where they can influence change. In 2016, on this very day, International Women's Day, women in Iran were arrested for peaceful protest. We know that women are not allowed to work without permission of their husbands, play sports, embark in democratic processes. We in Wales must do more to ensure that our sisters in Iran are protected and that we all choose to challenge the oppression of women in Iran. We are so in awe of your strength and resilience and your continued creativity to resist the silencing of your voices. We support all you do and we wish you all the best. Diolch yn fawr iawn. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much
thank you for your support
words.
and your speech. And we will continue the struggle together. Thank you very much.
Thank you to Jane and to Mrs. Rajavi. Our next speaker today is my colleague, the Right Honourable David Jones, Conservative Member of Parliament for Clwyd West and former Secretary of State for Wales. Welcome, David. We're looking forward to hearing what you have to say.
I'm sorry, I wasn't allowed to unmute. I thought I was trapped. But Mrs. Rajavi, colleagues and friends, and especially colleagues in Ashraf 3, it's a great pleasure to be with you today and to join such a distinguished panel of colleagues and prominent women's rights activists on International Women's Day. And I want to add my voice to those of the other speakers today and express my admiration and praise for the brave women of Iran and around the world who continue to fight for freedom, equality, and democracy in the face of an oppressive regime. I want today to remember several brave Iranian women, such as political prisoner Zara Safai and her daughter Parastu Moini, political prisoner Farooq Taghipur and her mother Nasim Jabari, political prisoner Nejat Anwar Hamidi, Ahdas Pourezrakh, and political prisoners Maryam Akbari Monfared, Sadiq Gay Morsali, Marzieh Farsi, and Samaye Bidi. These women have been handed harsh prison sentences for supporting the pro-democracy opposition, the PMOI, on concocted charges of assembly and collusion against national security and propaganda against the state. Many of them, like many other political prisoners of the regime, have been subjected to torture and in some cases denied medical treatment. On this day, too, we remember those brave women who continue to defy the regime, even as they remain in prison under harsh conditions. And they're an inspiration to us all. We must and we will continue to advocate on their behalf and urge our government and the international community to put pressure on the regime to secure their freedom, as well as the release of all political prisoners in Iran. I recently argued in an opinion piece for the Daily Express that Iran is a rogue state. We've known that for quite some time, and yet our leaders have consistently failed to adopt appropriate measures against the theocratic regime in Tehran. The United Kingdom should designate and proscribe Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps and the Ministry of Intelligence as terrorist organizations, and impose targeted punitive measures against them, against their leadership and those acting on their behalf, using the UK's new Magnitsky-style human rights sanctions procedures. Such measures would limit their ability to export terrorism and enforce the regime's oppressive and misogynistic policies in Iran. We must also seriously consider reducing our diplomatic relations with Iran. The privileged status afforded to diplomats was egregiously abused by the regime with the attempted attack on the NCRI's Free Iran rally in Paris in 2018, which was masterminded by a diplomat serving in the Iranian embassy in Vienna. And the United Kingdom should work closely with our principal allies, most particularly the Biden administration, to develop a new, uniform and robust approach to the regime in Tehran. To succeed, this policy must include dialogue with the pro-democracy resistance movement, the NCRI, and its president-elect, Mrs. Rajavi. The NCRI is the most enduring political coalition in Iran's modern history and has emerged as the only credible democratic alternative to the theocratic regime ruling Iran. It recognizes and embraces women's leadership and political participation, and it presents a democratic platform for the future Iran. Such action by the West, I believe, is crucial. Iran stands on the brink of change with growing popular protests across the country. The Western nations must be prepared to show their support now for the new free Iran, where the role of women is properly recognized and upheld. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. David Jones, for your support from the Iranian people, especially women's struggle. And as you truly said, the Iranian regime is a rogue regime. And you have been a great friend of our movement for democracy for over 2 decades, which is very inspiring to all of us. Thank you very much.
Sorry about that slight intermission. I was not being allowed to unmute myself, but the conference organisers have now relented and let me unmute myself. Inspiring words from Maryam Rajavi and equally inspiring words from David Jones. Thank you so much. The next speaker I'm honoured to be able to introduce is Ms. Anna Fortiga, who is a Polish member of the European Parliament and a member of the Foreign Affairs Committee and former Polish Foreign Minister. It's a great honour to have you join us, Ms. Fortiga, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Madam. Thank you, Madam Chair, dear Madam President-elect and distinguished colleagues. We usually in the West, in Europe in particular, tend to focus on our own affairs. Yet we have to know that today, in our contemporary times, we face murderous, extremely cruel regime of mullahs, and it is predominantly society of Iran, regardless of gender, the greatest victim of this cruel regime. Yet today, on International Women's Day, allow me to focus on extremely brave, courageous, and firm in their actions, women of Iran living there in their own country, tending to their families and willing to achieve freedom for their own society, facing unbelievable atrocities. There were women victims of capital punishment in Iran, many of them. There were women peacefully protesting against a variety of intimidating measures that were unbelievably cruelly treated by mullah's regime. Despite COVID-19, they try to pursue their work. Those Iranian ladies who stay outside of their country are very outspoken and persevering in their work to enhance the role of society, to modernize society, and to bring Iran once more to the family of free nations. I pay tribute to excellent work of Maryam Rajavi, and I can promise that within European Parliament, we stay by you, we stand by you, we name every victim of mullah's regime and try to make the situation of ordinary people in Iran better, while exposing the unbelievably criminal role of the current regime of Iran. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that contribution.
Thank you.
It's wonderful.
Thank you, Mrs. Fotika, for your message. The European Parliament has a very important role in defending human rights and women's rights in Iran in this critical situation. And thank you for all your effort in every time, in everywhere. And if you allow me, I would like to add a few words in Persian. بعد از صحبت‌های بسیار پرمعنای سخنرانان گرامی
After the meaningful speeches by many of my sisters and also every participant in this great conference, I must emphasize that the role of women in the equality is a key role for all the world. Because you mentioned that, I want to say a few words on that issue, including for confronting the many threats, including the threats of fundamentalism, which is the main challenge for peace, freedom, and equality in the world. The mullah's misogynist regime, the mullah's regime is based on misogyny, and therefore confronting that misogyny is the only way to get rid of this regime. And if we have managed to bring equality into our movement, because that is an essential part of our movement and our struggle, and we have responded to this need by giving women their roles. Therefore, if everyone put on the agenda the struggle or the confrontation with the Islamic fundamentalism and put aside the policy of appeasement, then they could have bigger achievements in the equality struggle because they are very much intertwined. The experience of the past 40 decades shows that the establishment of a religious fascism in Iran had not only suppressed the Iranian women, but had affected the equality of men and women in the whole region. And maybe one can say that throughout the world, it has affected that this regime by eliminating women from social and political life, and discrimination and brutal suppression and enforced hijab has tried to impose a policy of an atmosphere of fear and repression. The repressive laws are added every year, and if this regime avoid or put aside its misogyny, it destroys itself. And on the other hand, the Iranian resistance in confronting this regime and overthrowing the entirety of this regime, because that is its goal, has been able to reach the equality within its own. The very dear economic condition in Iran, there is no hope other than for reducing the pressure on the Iranian women. There is no other way but to get rid of this regime. The Iranian society is now at a very explosive situation, and the Iranian people are ready and resolute, and everything is really waiting for a change of regime in Iran, and this will add to the importance of the struggle of the Iranian women in confronting this regime, and will have the whole situation in Iran, in the region, and the whole world to get rid of this religious fascism. Therefore, I am extremely thankful to all of you for backing us, for supporting our sisters in this movement, and all men and women of Iran. Thanks again to every one of you for joining this conference.
Thank you so much, Madam Rajavi. It's a great honor for all of us parliamentarians and supporters of Iran freedom to be able to be on the same Zoom call as you. And whilst my Persian isn't good enough to ensure that I can understand your speech, I know that we all share your goals of a free and democratic Iran where women can finally enjoy the rights to which they should be entitled. And it is truly inspiring to be part of this gathering. And I know that we'll find further inspiration from our next guest speaker, Amber Rudd, who has an extremely distinguished record in government. I was delighted to serve with her in the cabinet. She is a former Home Secretary and former Work and Pensions Secretary. And we are looking forward, Amber, to hearing what you have to say to us today on International Women's Day.
Good afternoon. Thank you so much, Teresa, for that kind introduction. And it was a pleasure to serve with you as well in cabinet. And you too, I think, were a great icon of a woman leader showing what can be achieved. I choose to challenge. That's the message for today. It's a delight to be able to share my views on why challenge matters to bring about equality, and to reflect on what is taking place for the women of Iran. Women everywhere are challenging their society in different ways. It may be on education, on rights in the law, health rights. Different progress, of course, is vastly different in different parts of the world. In the US, there is the first woman to become vice president. Here in the UK, we are very proud to have had 2 women prime ministers, both of them conservative. We have made good progress since only getting the vote just over 100 years ago. And why does it matter? Many men will say, they've said it to me in Parliament, I expect they may have said it to Theresa quietly, it shouldn't matter, as men can represent women just as well as women do. But the truth is that facts don't bear that out. If you're not represented at the political high table, then your issues are not likely to be understood or considered. Representation leads to policy. Or perhaps more crudely, as the proverb says, if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. In conflicts, we need to do more to ensure that women are included in the negotiations. According to the UN, between 1992 to 2018, at major peace processes, only 13% of negotiators were women, 3% of mediators, and 4% of signatories. This is not good enough. This year, the world is coming together in Glasgow, in the United Kingdom, to try to find a way to limit dangerous climate change. It's an international UN-run meeting to limit carbon emissions that are doing such damage to our planet. I have a letter in the Times today calling for every national negotiating team to include women. Best of all, to reach 50-50. Women and girls are the worst affected by the consequences of climate change. They should be at the table to shape the deal. Climate change acts as a threat multiplier, making the dangers that exist even more emphatic. And women and children are 3 times more likely to die in disasters. So once more, women are the losers if action doesn't take place. In political life in the UK, 34% of MPs are women. Sadly, only 21% in the cabinet, which I'm afraid is down since your and my time, Theresa. On the board of the biggest companies in the UK, women now make up over 1/3 of all members. Some of us complain that we should do more, that true equality is 50-50, and that more should be done to support that goal. This isn't just about what is fair. 51% of the population should be 50% of the leadership, but about how to get better decision-making. Countless studies show that if women are properly involved in politics, in business, in any place of decision-making, then better decisions are taken. It makes sense to listen to all the arguments, not just the ones from men, and the policies are then more likely to work for everyone. But when I look at what the women of Iran have had to endure in terms of their rights, their health, their roles in society in general, I realize how much they have to endure, how limited their rights are, and how brave they are when they object. Looking at the video earlier before some of these speeches, it was remarkable to see how brave those women were. In Iran, women have to endure a religious regime that gives them very few rights. They do not have the freedom to choose how to live their lives. They do not have the same access to the law or to welfare benefits to survive. The freedoms to make our own choices, which we women in the West take for granted, is hardly available to the women in Iran. In a democracy, we have the route to make improvements for everybody's lives. We don't get everything right, but we do have a system that has checks and balances and a path to make changes to address inequalities. Legislation is looked at to ensure that it supports women as well as men. And the public, they have a role. They will challenge decisions that our executive make. Just look at the British Chancellor now and the 1% pay rise that he's offered to our nurses in the UK. The campaign to change that is picking up steam. So democracy has accountability at its core, which will help realize equality. And in Iran, it is so much more difficult to challenge the regime. Difficult, illegal, and above all, dangerous. But it is fascinating to see how the women of Iran do fight back. Like today's motto, they choose to challenge, not just today on International Women's Day, but every day. And just as we in the West often express ourselves through our clothes, the women of Iran subtly and subversively use their dress to challenge the restrictions of the regime. Yes, the hijab is compulsory, but many carefully, I notice, place it lower down to make their own point. And in the protests in 2019, there were many acts of resistance that were filmed and released to show women without veils, sometimes walking with and supported by their husbands and sons. Challenging the oppression of women is not just for women to do. It is also men who need to acknowledge the problem and call out for equality too. Men have an important role everywhere in recognizing the need for equality. Power is not something that anybody willingly gives up. It has to be fought for. But women need the men who love them and respect them to join the fight for equality. The Lebanese author Kim Gattas describes in her recent book the fight back by Iranian women through opposing the imposition of the veil in her extraordinary publication, Black Wave. The Black Wave is the veil, and she argues how it has been used to free or subjugate women, and that as a visible symbol, it can also be opposed. One of her themes is the exploitation of Islam by dictators and how they use that religion to control women. Individualism cannot be suppressed forever, and women of Iran are in the vanguard of making that point. Iran will only be free when the women of Iran are free. As with so many campaigns for equality, the strength of feeling is often revealed in the creative format of film and literature. The Iranian film director, Jafar Panahi's Offside, follows a day in the life of a group of Iranian girls attempting to watch their team's World Cup qualifying match against Bahrain at the stadium in Tehran. Many Iranian girls love football as much as their countrymen and sports fans all over the world, but they are prevented by law from attending these matches in their own country. Inspired by the day when his own daughter was refused entry to a football stadium in Iran, Jafar made this extraordinary and award-winning film. I recommend it. I watched it last night. It's available on YouTube if you haven't seen it. It's a serious story told with humor and therefore very effective at airing the arguments. Some people love football so much that they won't be barred from the matches. In his story, he reveals what Iranians have in common. Although the police in his film have to arrest and hold the girls who illegally came to the football match, in the conversations between them, he shows their common humanity. The girls argue against the ruling that means they're not allowed to attend. The policemen repeat the rules and try to defend them. But in the final scene, as they're being driven off to be charged, the police and the girls are all literally on the edge of their seats as they wait for the final whistle. You get the strong feeling that the regime and its rulers do not speak for these sympathetic young men and women of Iran. The difficulties and dangers of living under the Iranian regime are further revealed in other brilliant national literature. I love them because they praise the country, the people, and separate them from the government that does such damage. A few years ago, I read City of Lies by Ramita Navai. Let's get one thing straight, she says in her opening sentence. In order to live in Tehran, you have to lie. How could it be otherwise? Councils of perfection in religion, chastity, namus, and family honor, abru, were converted by the Islamic Republic into laws of the land, cruelly and sometimes fatally enforced. In few other places, she tells us, is the gulf so wide between what is said and what is done. Her book is full of the gritty reality of life, of relationships, of lies, and of the harsh choices faced by women. The book closes with one of her characters, Faride, an uptown survivor who loses patience when her yoga class is raided by morality police. So she moves to London. She finds the people of our capital a little cold and a bit mean, the weather gloomy, and the cost of living exorbitant. She begins to long for aspects of Tehran, she tells us. Its blue sky, the clamour of the streets, mulberry and jasmine. She calls it the smoky smell of lamb on hot coals. So she returns. The book is homage to Iran as a beautiful country and Tehran as a warm and welcoming city, but above all, to its people. Life is complicated and sometimes hard. But within that, the people of a country are different to its regime, and never more so than Iran. What an immensely complicated time for the country. What an opportunity, if it can be got right, for equality. What a journey to go on. So well done to the women of Iran who are indeed choosing to challenge. Thank you.
Dear Amber, thank you very much for your presence and support for the struggle of the Iranian women and their resistance. As you said, the women must actively participate in the political leadership. Yes, the Iranian women have chosen to challenge this brutal regime because the mullah's regime is a threat not only for the Iranian people and for the Iranian women. This regime is a threat for the people in the Middle East and for the peace and security in the world. And I'm sure that the Iranian people and especially the Iranian women will arrive the victory, and the victory is overthrow the mullah's regime and for freedom and democracy in Iran and peace and security in the region and in the world. Once again, thank you very much for your presence.
Thank you.
Well, like Mrs. Rajavi, I want to thank you for what was a wonderful speech, really inspiring. And I also want to convey my gratitude to everyone who's spoken so far. My time in the chair at this important virtual event is now drawing to a close, but it is wonderful to know that Iran has so many good friends amongst the people of both the United Kingdom and beyond. And so it is my great pleasure, firstly, to introduce Steve McCabe as our next speaker, Labour MP, and another good friend of a free Iran. But also, after that, I can say that I will be handing over to Sarvanaz Chitsaz, the chairwoman of the NCRI Women's Committee, to take over from me in the chair. So it is with great pleasure that I hand over now to Steve McCabe to hear his thoughts on International Women's Day and the struggle for freedom and equality in Iran.
The very, very excellent work. Thank you.
To be quite straightforward about this, we should, on this International Women's Day, be celebrating many wonderful Iranian women, past and present, from all walks of life. Women like Maria Korsan, the chief executive of SB Severages Tekniska in Sweden. Women like Sara Safari, the professor, engineer and mountain climber who's done so much to champion education for girls in Nepal, or the late poet Parvin Estasami. But sadly, today, Iran is not a place that celebrates women, not for their contribution, the contribution they make to science, culture, film, writing, poetry, law, or human rights. Indeed, that independence and talent and independence of mind can often lead to incarceration, to joining the hundreds of Iranian women locked away in the mullahs' jails and subjected to abuse, degradation, torture, and rape. Take the case of Sabah Cord Afshari, imprisoned in the quarantine section of Karchak Women's Prison, she was sentenced to 15 years on national security charges for removing her hijab in public as part of a campaign for women's rights. Like so many others, this 22-year-old woman's family says she has been denied much needed medical treatment. Another woman transferred to Karchak is Nazreen Sotoudeh, a human rights lawyer who was sentenced to 30 years for the same so-called national security offences. National security offences seem to mean speaking out against and challenging the regime. And of course, we've seen today the vile psychological torture being perpetrated on dual national Nazanin Zaghari Ratcliffe, who should at this very moment be at home in London with her child. The Iranian authorities have no respect for their own people or citizens of other countries. In Saravan, the Revolutionary Guards, the real power in Iran, recently opened fire on innocent demonstrators. It's against this background and the shocking revelations following the trial and conviction of Asadullah Assadi in Belgium that we must seriously consider our next moves in relation to this regime. The men in charge of the Revolutionary Guard, the mullahs, those who torture, murder and rape, they don't understand diplomacy. They don't appreciate efforts to seek peaceful resolution of conflicts. They interpret friendly gestures and concessions as a sign that the other side is caving in. We should make it abundantly clear that we won't negotiate with them unless they agree to give up all nuclear weapons development and the ballistic missile program in a way that's completely verifiable. We shouldn't negotiate with them unless we see a total end to their terrorist activities and assassination campaigns across the region and in all other parts of the globe. We want Nazanin Zaghari Ratcliffe free and at home in London where she belongs. That isn't negotiable. And we shouldn't negotiate with them until there's a complete end to the false imprisonments, the hostage taking, the execution, the rape, torture and murder. We shouldn't negotiate until they accept human rights and demonstrate their respect for the rights of women throughout Iran. Today we celebrate the powerful women of Iran who've given so much to the world. We remember the innocent women locked away in those dark, filthy prisons. We salute the brave women who won't be silenced, and we praise the leadership of you, Maryam Rajavi, and the hope you bring to so many that a better future is possible. The day of freedom will come, and all the talents of Iranian women, those in Iran and those forced to flee, will be liberated. We look forward to that day. Thank you.
For your presence and your valuable support in this critical situation. As you truly said, Western countries must reconsider their policy vis-à-vis this regime that is a threat for peace and security in the world. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Honorable Steve McCabe, and also Madam Rajavi for your contribution. I would like also to thank very much Honorable Teresa Villiers and also our dear Baroness Verma for co-chairing this conference and for their excellent work that they did during this conference. I would like now to introduce Bob Blackman, the Honorable Bob Blackman, MP and co-president of the International Committee of the Parliamentarians for a Democratic Iran. Please, Honorable Blackman.
celebrate the International Women's Day with you. I express my support for and send my best wishes to the Iranian women who are shouldering the main responsibility and hard task to bring down one of the most oppressive regimes in history and in our time. As Maryam Rajavi has said on many occasions, this regime cannot abandon terrorism, human rights violations, executions, or torture, even for one day, because if it did, it would immediately be overthrown by the people and the women of Iran, because the people see the regime as the real enemy of Iran. Misogyny is the regime's nature. It justifies and enforces the domestic repression of women by clamping down on women and implementing the repressive obligatory dress code against them. The regime has no capacity to reform. In other words, the principle of verifiable is the pillar of the regime's constitution, and it cannot be changed, even through a referendum. The Iranian people know this, and they express this understanding with their protests all across the country in the last 3 years, when they chant slogans like, "Down with the dictator," "Our enemy is right here," "They lie that it's America," "Reformers, hardliners, the game is over," and "Only by taking it to the street can we get our rights." The regime in Iran acts as a pariah state with nuclear extortion, hostage-taking diplomacy, terrorism, and destabilizing the region, complemented with a brutal domestic crackdown on legitimate protests, opposition, and dissenting voices. This unacceptable behavior must be met with maximum pressure and not maximum diplomacy by the United Kingdom and our allies in Europe and the United States. In this regard, it is totally unacceptable for the European Union to sponsor a business forum to advance trade in Iran with participation of European and Iranian diplomats, as was the case last week, while the regime is doing everything it can to exclude women from the Iranian society and prevent their economic participation or emancipation. In addition, the EU-Iran Economic Forum sent the wrong signal to the regime in Iran, the world's leading state sponsor of terrorism, at a time when one of its diplomats has been sentenced to 20 years for terrorism in Europe and for trying to bomb the opposition NCRI gathering in Paris. The United Kingdom, Europe, and the United States need to listen to the people of Iran and apply maximum pressure. The NCRI and the 10-point democratic platform of Maryam Rajavi is the theocracy's kryptonite. The 10-point plan of Maryam Rajavi has gained wide cross-party recognition in the United States Congress, in both houses of the United Kingdom Parliament and the European Parliament. We saw this with the strong support for a new resolution on Iran in the US Congress last month. House Resolution 118 and previous support for the early day motion on this topic in the United Kingdom, House of Commons, demonstrates that this is the will of the elected representatives of the people of our great countries. Supporting the Iranian people and the NCRI to free Iran from the grip of this brutal regime is the only long-term sustainable solution to secure and advance human rights, democracy, and equality in Iran. This must be the center and ultimate goal of the United Kingdom's policy on Iran. Women are now standing up to the regime to realize the democratic aspirations of the Iranian people, which today, in my view, converges with both the economic and security interests of the United Kingdom and Europe at large. This is the real win-win policy for the United Kingdom and Iran, in contrast to dialogue and the flawed nuclear deal with the mullahs that many civil servants, diplomats, and proponents of appeasing the regime claim. So let us avow ourselves that by this time next year, when we celebrate International Women's Day, we do so in Tehran with a free Iran and women properly emancipated. Thank you for allowing me to participate in this excellent conference.
Thank you, Mr. Blackman. You have explained very well the situation in Iran and the situation in the Iranian resistance. Thank you for your support and solidarity. Yes, indeed, as you said, this regime is the enemy of the Iranian people, and Western countries must put maximum pressure on this terrorist regime. Thank you very much.
I also thank you very much, Honorable Blackman. And now I am honored to invite Senator Catherine Noon, the former Deputy Speaker of the Irish Senate.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, Maryam Rajavi, distinguished guests, and all other women who are with us today throughout the world. Happy International Women's Day. It's an honor for me to speak at this conference to defend the rights of Iranian women who have been strong enough to resist for so many years to finally sweep the misogynistic mullahs out of Iran, and I wish them well. Violence against women is something we all wish to address, especially on International Women's Day. The situation in Iran, as we all know, is particularly bad. At least a decade of foot dragging in the adoption of any law to protect women from violence has placed Iran at the very top of the list of countries with the highest records of violence against women. They say, and imagine this, they say that 66% of Iranian women experience violence in their lifetime. That's just staggering. Women's security and equality, freedom and social justice will never be realized in Iran under the mullah's misogynistic regime. Why? Because violence against women is effectively sponsored by the government, and it is institutionally, in the laws, it is institutionalized by the laws. Iranian women are smart enough not to heed the empty promises of the regime. Instead, as other speakers have alluded to, they spearhead and lead the protest to overthrow the misogynistic regime and courageously pay the price for doing so. It's great to see you, Maryam Rajavi, and I was very pleased to meet you in Paris a couple of years ago. And, I admire you for the strong resistance you have built up through all of the ups and downs and always moving towards final victory. And you have my full support. I've been informed today of a meeting that our foreign minister attended in Iran. He's just back. And I spoke to him today because I, like others, was very concerned to hear about that. And it's important to emphasize that that meeting was in the context of Ireland's role on the Security Council. We're a new member of the Security Council. And it is in the context of a nuclear security. And I think above all, one thing we all want to ensure is that Iran does not become a nuclear power. And it is an agreement that was put in place some years ago that had been, that Trump had done away with. And now the Biden administration are keen to reactivate and reestablish. And it is purely from a security point of view. But while Minister Coveney was there, because I, like many other Irish politicians, since I've known Hussein and since he's come to Dublin to visit us and since we've gone to different events in Paris and other places, we have all emphasized the human rights atrocities that we have learned about and that we are so aware of. And he was very mindful of that when making his trip. He told me that during his meeting with the Foreign Affairs Minister there, that he raised the issue of women and their treatment in particular, and minors, and the LGBT community. So I was very glad to hear that. And it certainly means that your efforts in working with us politicians throughout the world, that they are not in vain, and that message was brought by our minister to Iran, to the regime, to let them know that it is not acceptable, their treatment and the way that they conduct their regime. So I'd just like to again say a very happy International Women's Day to the women, especially the Iranian women on this conference, and women throughout the world. We support you in your endeavors, and it's an honor to speak with you today. Thank you.
Madam Senator, for your support for the Iranian women who seek justice, democracy, and equality. You explained very well that the Iranian women will not believe the regime's lies. This is a struggle that we will continue together. And I'm very happy to see you, and I hope that we can see you as soon as possible here. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, dear Senator Noon. And now I would like to invite our dear friend, Anita McIntyre, former Conservative member of the European Parliament and a great friend of the Iranian people and the NCRI, to take the floor.
Thank you. Dear Maryam Rajavi and distinguished guests and my Iranian sisters, it is a great privilege and honor to join you all on this International Women's Day and to highlight the situation of women in Iran who are suffering under the ghastly misogynist clerical regime which rules the country. We've already heard today about the appalling treatment of Zahra Ismaili, who was hanged in prison just over 2 weeks ago. She saw 16 prisoners hanged in front of her. She had a heart attack before she could be taken to the gallows, but nevertheless, the prison guards hanged her lifeless body. But why was she executed? What terrible crime had she committed? Zahra was innocent, but she claimed responsibility for killing her husband in order to save her teenage daughter, who had in fact shot him in the head. And why did the daughter kill her father with the help of her brother? Because her father routinely abused his wife and children. He had threatened to kill his wife, and he had attempted to rape his daughter. Now, this man was a director at the Mullah's Ministry of Intelligence. So he was an official of the Iranian regime. In fact, working in the same ministry that was involved in the foiled terrorist plot, which planned to kill hundreds of people at the Free Iran gathering in Paris in 2018. A plot which a Belgian court recently found an Iranian diplomat guilty of commanding. In my time as a member of the European Parliament, I was very proud to be a member of the Friends of a Free Iran. We campaigned for the European Union to sever diplomatic and trade relations with Iran until human rights are respected. I find it absolutely sickening to see European commissioners and officials pursuing trade relations, appeasing the mullahs, and ignoring their abuse of human rights, especially women's rights. Now, we are free women. We can make choices. We can wear what we like. We can marry whomever we like. We can voice our opinions. In Iran, women have no such freedoms. Rouhani's regime has increased the restrictions on women. 114 women have been executed, and many women are in prison because they dared to express their opinions. We have a duty to continue to raise public awareness and to insist that the international community play their part in holding the Iranian regime to account for their crimes. So let us promise our sisters in Iran that we will choose to challenge and do everything in our power to make this change. Thank you.
Dear Antina McIntyre, thank you very much for your supporting, because you are everywhere and every time beside the Iranian resistance. And as you said, women's rights are very important, and we believe that this is a benchmark for all democratic countries. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Is my dear friend and colleague, Mrs. Zinat Mir Hashemi, member of the NCRI and also the editor of a Nabarde Khalq publication. خانم میر هاشمی عزیز بفرمایید.
درود بر همه شما. من صحبت‌های امروزم رو با این سوال شروع می‌کنم.
I salute you all. I begin my speech with this question. Can you guess
مدنی و جزایی در ایران به کدام قرن مربوط میشه؟
to what century goes back the Iranian women's rights enshrined in the constitution of Iran? If we believe that women's rights is a universal right, and the fact that the universal right for human rights has been written for all people, I must say Iranian people's rights have no connection to these rights right now. We can look at it from two aspects. We face, on one hand, very brave, very well educated women who are challenging the system. On the other side, we have a brutal medieval system that represses women and institutionalizes the repression of women. In that way, it blocks women from progress. If in the time of this slavery, if people were dragged with chains in the 21st century slavery, women are being enslaved in the modern way. Especially, we can't even imagine how women are being brutalized in Iran by men. They can be beheaded by an axe by their men. But the laws of the Islamic Republic of Iran support those men. And in the penal code of the Islamic Republic of Iran, it says if the murderer is a father or a grandfather of that woman, they are barred from being taken to the court. So we look to other groups such as Taliban, Daesh, and others, ISIS. They are known for these repressive views on women. But you can't imagine all those things and much more are being legalized in Iran. They have been enshrined in the Iranian law. Women from this has been implied in the books from schools in different laws, polygamy, and all of these different ways in the society. When we look to the poverty and the social problems that people face every day. So my answer to the question I raised is this, that women of the regime has enchained the women as if we were in many centuries ago. But we also have to look at the will and the power of the determination of the women in Iran. How they are being on the forefront, in the first line of all protests against the regime. The resistance of women can be seen among the mothers of the martyrs of the 2019 November uprisings, also those in the 1980s whose children were executed in the dungeons of the regime. We can see women in the movement, justice-seeking movement for the 1988 massacres, and also in different communities that has been shaped to challenge the death penalty in Iran. Also, we see in the fight for socialism, we see there are many women in the November uprising that were present. We can see women in the prisons like Maryam Rajavi, Golchini Rai, and many others. The prisons of Evin, Qarchak, in Varamin, and many other prisons, what they are doing to women, that shows the brutality of the mullahs. At this point, I call on all women who are politicians, reporters, or whatever, that when they go to Iran, to avoid accepting the laws of the mullahs, that the repressive compulsion of the mullahs on the women, and such as accepting the forced veiling is in a way support for the repressive laws of the mullahs. If you want to see the difficult situation of women, you talk to the mothers of the martyrs, the families of the political prisoners, those who have been executed, or those women who are suffering in Sistan and Baluchistan province, women or children, girls who have no place for education, who have no water to drink, those who sleep in paper bags. So this is not different from the other aspects of the repression of the regime. At the end, all those who fight for women's rights around the world, I salute them. I thank them for listening to me, for giving me this opportunity to this short intervention.
بعد بگم که زینت از زنان
I must say that Mrs. Hashemi was one of the fighters for women in both the Shah dictatorship and the Mullah dictatorship. She was in the prison of the Shah because she stood up against the Shah dictatorship. And in the time of the Mullahs, from the first day until today, she has been in the first line, in the forefront in the struggle. She hasn't left the scene even one day. Thank you. I salute you. And I'm glad that our resistance has the support of such great women.
I now would like to invite Mr. Christian Wakeford, Conservative Member of a Parliament for Berry South. Mr. Wakeford.
Well, thank you for inviting me to speak at today's very important conference on International Women's Day. I'd like to start by saying, there's been many times I've spoken about Iran in the House of Commons, but to be clear, my negativity isn't towards Iran, but to the regime. It's not to its people, because its people are arguably more at risk than anyone over a very toxic atmosphere in the Middle East. I find myself in a very awkward position where I'm actually channeling my inner Alex Salmond, where Iran's people haven't failed, its leadership has failed its people. Iran's women haven't failed, it's its leadership that's failed its women. We are seeing a community and the people that are ready to thrive and go out into a global world, and be held back by what I can only describe as a brutal regime that has very poor views on women in general, but poor views on human rights across the world, and in particular the West. It's very easy for me to stand here and sit here and speak to you as a straight white male. I'm very fortunate not to be in a position where I'm held back or I'm kind of viewed against. But I think the topic of today being resolute and resilient, sums up Iranian women to a T, because you've had no choice but to be resolute and resilient for decades under this regime. Like I said, you are ready to thrive, but you are held back. You are ready to go out and work, but you are held back. You are ready to remove the niqab, the burqa, your headdress, but you are held back. You have strong supporters, not only in the UK Parliament, but across the West and across the globe, and especially in the Middle East. But what you really need is support at home. So if there is anything that we can do as parliamentarians, we will do so. We will call out your regime where it is doing things wrong, and state-sponsored terrorism, as is almost a mainstay, is called out almost on a daily basis. But we need peace in Iran, because without peace in Iran, we have no peace in the Middle East. And at the moment, it's that region which is one of the most polarized in the world. So we will continue to send strong messages of support to all those that need it. You will not only have the support, but you will have the means to actually stand up and make your voices heard, because for far too long, you haven't been heard. So I think really it's a very clear message, and that is, if you are going out there in the world, speak to all contacts that you have. Let them know the plight of Iranian women, and let them know what you want to see as a free, prosperous, global Iran. In recent weeks, I've been speaking in Parliament about the dangers of Daesh as being a destabilizing a regime of their own, essentially, in the Middle East. But they are essentially in a position where they are able to thrive because they are sponsored by the regime. We see the IRGC not only committing acts of atrocity on your home soil, but across the Middle East and across the globe. And again, that is down to the regime. So we've seen sanctions applied, and I think we heard earlier from Bob Blackman and other colleagues about the Magnitsky sanctions that have been applied. But we do need to go further. We do need to say that actually enough is enough, and we do need serious action, whether that is through the JCPOA or further means to actually say we're not taking any more action, because we do need to support a free people of Iran. So you have my support in doing so, because I want to see Iranian women prosper in the sciences, prosper in philosophy, prosper in every field you set your mind to it, because the only thing that should hold you back is yourself, not a state, not its leadership. So you have our support in doing so, and we will continue to lend that support until you are free and you can prosper. So resolute and resilient, you have been. Unfortunately, you need to stay that way for hopefully just a bit longer, but we will continue to support you throughout that journey.
Thank you very much, Mr. Wickford, for your support and also for your contribution.
And this regime is the main sponsor of terrorism in the world. I'm sure that your support can put an end to this regime, and I'm sure that our struggle will continue, and we will see the free Iran. If you allow me, I would like to talk about the experience of the most important issue in the Iranian resistance. And if you allow me, I speak in Persian. با توجه به نکاتی که سخنرانان عزیز و محترم و گرامی تو این برنامه گفتن، اجازه بدین من در اینجا استفاده کنم از فرصت و به یک قسمت کوتاهی
to considering what the distinguished speaker said, let me use this opportunity to just share with you a fraction of the experience of the Iranian resistance during many years. This movement in the struggle with the misogynist regime of the mullahs during this difficult struggle, they reached the conclusion that if they want to stand up to the regime, they have to fight back and confront all aspects of the misogynist regime. Therefore, women who had made a lot of sacrifice in this struggle played a major role in the heart of this movement. Women, in addition to the equality fight, created other aspects of a democratic society. In every part of the world, there are individual women who have played a key role in their society, which is a matter of great happiness for each one of us. But let's not forget that the participation of women in the political leadership of a movement as a generation is a very difficult and herald a society of equality and a free and equal society. Therefore, we have seen major changes in the situation of women in our movement. For example, women with great expression have taken responsibility to help their own people, and they do not condition it to anything, and they recognize no limit to taking responsibility in facing unpredictable situation and have shown great flexibility and been able to adapt to the situation. These women have reached the belief that for every difficult question, there is a solution. So they have closed every door and shows that women cannot do it, but they have learned to join hand in hand to fight this problem. The Central Council of the MEK, which include more than 1,000 women, that what they have learned is to put their own interest at the side and not to be always at the forefront of their own interest, particularly in along with their brothers and sisters who are engaged in the same struggle. They have created a new movement. So I have to report to you, women who are struggling for equality, I have to say that men have also reached a new level of emancipation, and based on this human progress have played a major role alongside women, and they have greatly played their own responsibility far more than ever before. Therefore, we must say that we are very proud that we have a generation of women, emancipated women, emancipated from the ideology, who are really the vanguard of equality movement for the Iranian people and probably throughout the world. And also we have a generation of emancipated women, of men who are free from this ideology of individualism and who are also have changed their outlook about women, and this is the great prospect of the equality which is before the Iranian people and the people of the world. And this not only necessary for the overthrow of this regime, but is also more necessary for the free and emancipated Iran of tomorrow. Because the people of Iran, with all the suffering that they've had for many years, they need emancipated men and women who would be able to work together and they need to really make the progress for the future of Iran. So once again, I thank you for giving me the opportunity.
I now have the honor to welcome dear Strawn Stevenson, former member of the European Parliament and also president of the European. I have the honor to introduce Strawn Stevenson, former member of the European Parliament and also the European president of the European Parliament delegation for relation with Iraq and the coordinator of the campaign for Iran Change, and also very dear friend of the Iranian resistance. Please, Mr. Strawn Stevenson.
Thank you very much indeed, Madam Chairman, and thank you, Madam Rajavi. It is a great privilege for me to be with you all today on this Zoom conference and to send you greetings from Scotland, particularly to my sisters and brothers in Ashraf-Free and in Iran itself, of course, and around the world. You know, on International Women's Day, if we wish any further evidence of the misogynist lunacy of the mullahs, then we should look no further than the news that Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, the supreme leader, has ordered that cartoon character women must wear the hijab. So now in Iran, even animated female characters in cartoons cannot reveal their hair. You know, it would be amusing if it wasn't so serious. Women's dress codes are under constant scrutiny in Iran. They must wear the hijab, and morality police are on relentless patrol to enforce the law. Women, particularly young women, are singled out for brutal attacks for the crime of malveiling. Girls who were deemed to be improperly dressed in the street have suffered horrific acid attacks and stabbings in assaults openly condoned by the mullahs. Teenage girls arrested for the offense of posting videos of themselves dancing or singing on social media have been publicly flogged, and young female students attending end-of-term parties have been fined and beaten. This is what gender equality looks like in Iran today. The hanging of a 23-year-old woman in Ardabil prison on 22nd February took the toll of women executed by the Iranian regime, as we've heard today already, to at least 114 so far during the presidency of Hassan Rouhani, who is the supposed moderate. Iran is now the world leader in executions per capita, as well, of course, of executions of women and juvenile offenders. Over 4,300 people have been executed since Rouhani took power in 2013, with the number of overall executions and those of women actually believed to be much higher, because the fact is most of these executions take place in secret without witnesses. You know, that's like the entire population of a small town has been wiped out under Rouhani, the so-called moderate president. Young Iranian women are becoming increasingly engaged in the growing opposition to the mullah's corrupt regime. They are joining the resistance units that are springing up in every town and city in Iran. In the nationwide uprisings that have taken place, tens of thousands of courageous female teachers, medical staff, nurses, students, factory workers, and even pensioners have taken to the streets to demand an end to the regime's aggressive military adventurism across the whole of the Middle East. The mass protests are continuing even during the pandemic. Hundreds of women have been amongst those killed, and thousands have been arrested by the IRGC, the regime's Gestapo. Today, Iranian women are at the forefront of the resistance to the theocratic dictatorship. Indeed, the main democratic opposition movement, the PMI-MEK, is led, as we know, by the charismatic Mrs. Maryam Rajavi. And brave women are now routinely joining their brothers to demand regime change and an end to the misogyny and repression, which has terrorized not only the Iranian people for the past 4 decades, but a vast part of the Middle East as well. Addressing an International Women's Day conference, Malala Yousafzai, the Nobel laureate, said, "We realize the importance of our voice when we are silenced." Well, Malala Yousafzai was right. The women of Iran are no longer prepared to be silenced. They will be heard, and their cry for freedom and democracy will resonate around the world. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Stevenson. You are always a pioneer in every field, and your support for the cause of the Iranian women is very important. You have been with us in all campaign against the mullahs, and you know very well the nature of this regime. Thank you very much.
I also thank you, Mr. Stevenson, for his presence and for his contribution to our conference. Now may I welcome Sir Roger Gale, conservative member of the Parliament, and also he was the leader of the British delegation to the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe until this January. Please, Mr. Roger Gale.
Madam President, friends, it's a huge pleasure to have this opportunity today, International Women's Day, to send my good wishes to the women of Iran and to all Iranian women in the diaspora around the world, and to recognize your efforts to advance and promote women's rights and equality. Recently, Madam President-elect, the UK House of Commons Foreign Affairs Committee published its review on UK's policy on Iran. It set out a series of recommendations to the UK government to improve and to make our Iran policy more effective. One of the recommendations in the report was that the Iranian people are the victims of the poor choices made by the Iranian state, yet they're too often a secondary consideration. The UK's strategy going forward should rebalance this oversight. For the UK-Iran relationship to be meaningful and mutually beneficial, the UK must invest in strengthening cultural ties, fostering exchanges, and building upon common values shared with the Iranian people. That's a quote from the report. So, to implement this recommendation, the United Kingdom government is going to have to engage with the pro-democracy resistant movement. That, of course, is the NCRI, and with its president-elect, Maryam Rajavi. As we heard in her remarks earlier today, women are playing a prominent role, both in organizing the protests inside the country and in shaping the struggle against the regime. And they're not just doing that today, they've been doing it for the last 42 years. The United Kingdom shouldn't limit its policy to holding one-sided dialogue with a regime that doesn't respect the basic rights of its own people. We have to reach out and talk to the pro-democracy opposition, the NCRI, in order to hear the true voice and the aspirations of the Iranian people. Another recommendation in the Commons Foreign Affairs Committee report was that Iran's human rights record and selective commitment to upholding international law is a threat to the rules-based international system, the system by which, of course, all democracies abide. Time has come for a more robust approach. For its next round of Magnitsky-style sanctions, we, that's the committee, recommend that the Foreign and Commonwealth and Development Office prioritizes building watertight cases against human rights abusers based in Iran or acting for it abroad, including those involved in the arbitrary detention of UK and dual nationals. And of course, today particularly, we are thinking of Nazarene Zaharie Ratcliffe, a lady who has served a 5-year prison sentence for a crime that she did not commit, ought to be free, ought to be home in Britain, ought to be with her family, but now faces more trumped up charges when she has to go back to court on Sunday. In this regard, the current head of Iran's judiciary, Ebrahim Raisi, is a prime candidate for Magnitsky-style human rights sanctions, given the watertight evidence against him, documenting his role and responsibility in the regime's current and past atrocities. And that, of course, includes the 1988 massacre of 30,000 political prisoners, where he and other officials in the death committees oversaw the execution of young girls and pregnant women. And also during the November 2019 protests, when at least 400 women were killed by the regime's security machinery. What better way to support the women and people of Iran than by our Foreign Secretary, Dominic Raab, announcing new sanctions against Raisi today, International Women's Day, or at the very least, in the immediate future. I send my very best wishes to all the women in Iran, and particularly to those brave Iranian women who are leading the resistance movement. We are with you. We support you in your struggle for equality and liberty, and we will go on doing so until the day when Iran is truly free. Thank you.
I'm very happy to see you again. Your support is very important in this difficult situation. Indeed, we are facing a very brutal regime, and as you said, UK must put further pressure on this regime. And you are one of the pioneers in this path. Once again, thank you very much for all your effort.
I also, on my part, thank you very much, Sarah Javid, for your speech and your contribution. And may I now welcome Madam Senator Michelle Mulherin, a former Irish senator from Fine Gael Party. Please, Senator Mulherin.
Hello, Mrs. Rajavi and all who are attending online this conference today. I'm delighted to join with you to mark International Women's Day by having a special focus on the terrible oppression which women in Iran are facing, and how we might, through this dialogue, continue to highlight it and push for change. And I'm delighted to play a part in that in whatever way that I can do so. I think listening to so many stories today of oppression and the state of affairs that citizens in Iran face, I think in reality it is very hard for us to imagine as women living in the Western world, where we enjoy so many freedoms now, and to think that this can be happening in such an intensive and brutal way is quite shocking to us. I think it's very clear that the manner in which the Iranian regime is treating its citizens, and particularly its women, is only handicapping itself. It's handicapping the progress of the country, both domestically, economically, and internationally, and no good can come from it. And in fact, I think it's fair to say that the behavior of oppression and brutality towards women and towards citizens in general who dare to speak out or express themselves, their own people in effect, a regime that brutalizes its own people is a desperate regime and has no moral authority when that is the only way that it can govern. And I'm delighted to stand in solidarity today with what your objectives are, Mrs. Rajavi, and all who support you in bringing freedom to your country and freedom to the people of the country to be the same, to be different, but freedom nonetheless. Ireland is facing into a new role on the UN Security Council, and I also, like some of my colleagues who've spoken before, have spoken with our Minister for Foreign Affairs, Simon Coveney. And I know that it is his intention to be a force for good in Iran. And the issue is not just an Iranian nuclear deal, which the international community is seeking to salvage, but it must go hand in hand with the addressing of human rights atrocities which are taking place in Iran and which nobody can stand for. So none of these issues are in isolation, and we do not get the justice that we seek unless all issues are addressed in the round. And I know that, and as my colleague, former Senator Noon has said there, that Minister Coveney takes his opportunity in this bilateral meeting in Iran to raise issues of these offences against women and to seek to bring progress to all issues of oppression which exist in Iran. And as I have said, I want to continue in my support, and I want to congratulate the British Committee for Iran Freedom in facilitating this today. And it's always important, especially at this time of COVID-19 coronavirus, where we are being isolated from each other, that we get platforms to continue the fight and the good work that you are about. Thank you.
شنیدین راست میگین، خیلی دردناک بود، ولی واقعا فقط گوشه‌ای بود از واقعیت‌های اونچه که در ایران امروز میگذره علیه مردم ایران و به ویژه زنان ایران.
A sample of what women are suffering from, as you rightly said. There is no way out for these people, especially these women, except for the fact that they have to overthrow the mullahs. And I'm sure that they will do that and to bring democracy and freedom to Iran.
For your support and solidarity with the Iranian women. The Iranian women's struggle for freedom and democracy will continue, and we will count on your support and the support of all freedom lovers in the world. Thank you very much.
Also want to thank you, Madam Senator, for your contribution and also your support and your speech. Now I want to introduce a very renowned singer and also a defiant activist and a friend of resistance, of Iranian resistance, Mrs. گیسو شاکری. از خانم گیسو شاکری، هنرمند برجسته و متعهد مقاومت، دعوت میکنم. بفرمایید خانم شاکری.
با درود به زنان مبارز و آزادیخواه.
I salute the brave women fighters for freedom, women imprisoned, women who are rising up, the mothers of those who have been murdered, thousands of women in Ashraf, and dear Maryam. Today, and on this occasion, I would like to once again remind and say with loud voice until the very end, for the overthrow of the mullahs, we will stand together for the overthrow of the mullahs until the very end, to end more than 4 decades of injustice and misogyny. We will not forget, we will not forgive.
ای جانیان، وحشتتان از حضور ما زنان در میدان مبارزه بسیار بجاست، زیرا که این ما زنان هستیم.
You are right to fear the women, you murderers, because we, the women who stand together, we will bring down you brutal murderers who are against the women, against justice and liberty. We, the Iranian women fighter, we stand up and we have create you nightmares every day, and we are those who will bring freedom to Iran. Now I would like to sing a song which is the voice of a generation, of awakened generation, who will not give up until freedom has been achieved.
عزمی بی صبری کاشفای گنج رزم و جنگیدن سنگر به سنگر تا ایستادن تا دم آخر سر کی بلا سر مازرای شیر مرد و دشمنی نگاه کن ببین آی ایران زمین رسم سارا دست حافظه دست سما رسمشون وفا راهشون فدا تاپ تاپ نبرد دلا پر درد تاپ تاپ عبور شد پر شور رگا پر غرور دلا پر سرور سر کی بلا سر مازرای شیر مرد و دشمنی نگاه کن ببین آی ایران زمین یکیشون نسیم یکیشون ندا یکی از سرم یکیشون نگاه یکیشون مژده یکیشون رها هی هی سوار جاده پرغبار تاپ تاپ امید نسل بیشمار صدای پای هزار تا سوار هزار تا سوار دارن میارن واسه ایران گذر به گذار مژده بهار سر کی بلا سر مازرای شیر مرد و دشمنی نگاه کن ببین آی ایران زمین آی ایران زمین نسل اشرفان این زنای شیر
با تشکر زیاد از گیسوی عزیز که مثل همیشه جنگاور و پر از روحی و انرژی.
Thank you, Gisu. You have always been a fighter, full of energy, full of fight and will to struggle, unresting soul,
در جنگ با
which in
استبداد
every moment
مذهبی
is in fight
و
against
من منتظرم که همه این تلاش
religious dictatorship, and I'm looking forward that all these efforts very soon will lead result, and until the day men and women of Iran can join together and listen to these very powerful songs in the Freedom Square of Tehran. Thank you.
گیسو شاکری عزیز برای اجرای ترانه
Thank you
بسیار
again,
زیبا و همچنین
Mrs. Shakeri, for this great
بسیار
performance
محتوایی که کردی.
and also
Thank you very much,
very
Mrs. Gisu Shakeri,
powerful
for your
speech that she made in the
performance and
beginning.
also for your speech. Now our next speaker is Miss Sarah Khoshkalam from the organization, member of the organization of the Khebat of Iranian Kurdistan. خانم سارا خوشکلام از سازمان خبات کردستان ایران. خانم سارا خوشکلام بفرمایید.
درود دوستان گرامی. زنان نسل
Hello, dear women, brave revolutionary women. Let me begin to send you our salutations for the March 8th International Women's Day, and we wish the freedom of Iran, especially Kurdistan, from the repression of the mullahs. Today is a day for women who are in the first line of fight, who have been fighting for human values throughout the history. It is a very special day for women who are have been fighting these years. It's a day that men and women join commitments for freedom. The history of emancipation of women in Kurdistan has been very well remarked, especially 4 decades of struggle against the mullahs regime that Kurdish people have been leading this struggle. And women next to the men have joined this struggle against the brutal repressive regime. Women have been in the ranks of the Khabat organization for several years. From 1990s, women have had role in the positions of the organization, also in the military ranks of our movement. We women in the ranks of this Khabat organization, we continue to try to play a role, and therefore we have the institutional women within the organization of Khabat, and we try to have a stronger role in the struggles of this. And now we have 3 women who are in the leadership of the Khabat organization. So the institutional women within our organization gives more power to the women for plans for future of Iran, especially for women in Kurdistan. And exchange of views in our organization, the role of women will help to accelerate this process for us to reach our goals. Especially in Kurdistan, where women are denied every right. So we help them to know about their rights. The institutional women of Khabat organization today, on this very big day of women, is doing everything it can to help the Iranian people and women for freedom. And until the very final victory, we remain strong in this field, and we continue to support the women of Kurdistan. On this occasion, I send our greatest message to the women in our country who are fighting against the mullahs and do everything they can for equal rights for women. This message was from the Khabat organization of Iran. Thank you very much, Mrs. Sara Khoshkalam. I heard you, and I'm very pleased for that. Especially, I'm sure that women like you, women of Kurdistan, will go hand in hand with the women in the PMI organization. And please send our best regards to our sisters in the Khabat organization. I'm sure that the rights of the Kurdish women, which also we have seen in the plan for autonomy for Iranian Kurdistan by the NCRI that was adopted several years ago, the future of Iran will see the rights of Kurdish people to be upheld in the best way, and I'm sure you also will be among the vanguards and the forefronts of those who have the right of who enjoy this right, and I salute you very much.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Khoshkalam, for your presence and also for your speech in today's conference. Now may I welcome Dr. Rowan Williams, former Archbishop of Canterbury and a prominent member of the House of Lords. Please, Rowan Williams, Dr. Rowan Williams.
Great pleasure and privilege to be able to address this meeting and to recognize the presence of Mrs. Rajavi here with us. We are celebrating International Women's Day. And whenever we do this, we need to bear in mind the crucial role which the empowerment of women plays in the advancement of any society. It's a commonplace recognition now that raising the status and recognizing the skills of women is an essential part of driving forward a society that is more participatory and democratic, but also one which is more effective in its education and its healthcare. That is why any regime, any society in which women's skills and capacities are systematically denied or repressed is one that must cause great concern in the global community. And we know that this is one of the great problems facing Iranian society under its present regime. It is a very striking fact indeed that women have been at the forefront of protest and resistance within Iran, especially within the last couple of years, and of course beyond its borders in the emigre community. And the fact that women have played so prominent and so transformingly courageous a role in the politics of Iranian society in resistance to tyranny tells its own story. It tells a story of repression and discontent, but also of confidence and hope. And this event today is not simply about the history of repression. It is also about the renewal of hope. Hope for an Iranian future which will be good news for all its citizens. A future for the Iranian people in which women can play their full and proper part in developing a society that is sustainable and compassionate and just. And it's important to say, as we think of these things, that this discourse about the rights of women is not some kind of Western agenda, not some kind of foreign imposition upon Iranian society. Concern about the rights and dignities of women comes from the deepest roots in that shared Jewish, Muslim, and Christian civilization and religious perspective, which has so transformed our world. This is not a stalking horse for alien values. It is an expression of what is most deeply rooted, the values we share and care about, the values which will truly transform human possibilities. So we are meeting in that hope, the hope of a future where a common vision shared by the great religious and cultural traditions of the region will come to flower. A future where women are able indeed to play their part. A future where sectarian, partisan, bigoted policies, state-sponsored violence, state-sponsored untruth will at last be something of the past. In the confidence and the hope of that just, compassionate, democratic future, I send greetings for this event and assure you and the Iranian people of my continuing prayers and support for a just future. Thank you for the opportunity of sharing this event and speaking to you.
Thank you very much, Archbishop Dr. Williams. You have always supported the oppressed people, and your presence in this conference sends a very important message to the religious dictatorship ruling Iran. God bless you.
I also thank you, Dr. William, for your contribution and also your presence in today's conference. I would like now to introduce dear Farzaneh Hosseini, President of the Association of the Women, Pioneer Women Association Against Fundamentalism and Discrimination. از فرزانه حسینی عزیز مدیر انجمن پیشتاز بر علیه بنیادگرایی و تبعیض میخوام که صحبتشو شروع کنه.
Dear friends, distinguished speakers, President-elect Mrs. Rajavi, it is my pleasure to address you today on behalf of the Anglo-Iranian Pioneer Women Association Against Fundamentalism and Discrimination. It is a pleasure, but as an Iranian woman, it is also somewhat bitter to speak on this day, which should be a day of celebration for all. Many women, and indeed men, are celebrating today the huge progress which has been made in securing treatment for women the same as men in all aspects of their lives, and to celebrate their achieving the right to live at peace within themselves and with dignity. The right to live a dignified life has not been afforded to the women of Iran, despite their perseverance and the huge sacrifices they have made over the past 4 decades and the risks with which they live each day. That right of a dignified life was not afforded to my grandmother, who spent days and days over several years waiting outside the walls of the prison of Evin, awaiting news of her children, to have been told one day, mockingly, that they had been killed by firing squad, and that one of their bodies would not be returned to the family because he had criticized the supreme leader in the last letter which he wrote before his execution. That dignity was not afforded to my aunt, whose hands were tied and who was shot in the neck during the 1st of September 2013 massacre at Camp Ashraf. She had spent the best part of her youth in Iran's jails, younger than I am now, and later joined the Iranian resistance at Camp Ashraf, along with many other brave women of the PMOI, who are an inspiration to me, as well as many other women like me. Dignity is not afforded to the 42 million women currently living in Iran, essentially imprisoned, desperate but unable to leave, who continue to face discrimination which is entrenched in every aspect of their lives, from marriage to divorce to inheritance to employment. The personal stories of Iran's women will never be properly told nor fully appreciated. And whilst we Iranian women, directly or indirectly like me, have endured the indignity of being an Iranian woman in the current times, we are undeterred in the face of intimidation, abuse, and threats. Despite the challenges and the heartache, we are stronger and more determined than ever. And with the leadership of Mrs. Rajavi and the NCRI, to whom I will forever be grateful, we have a platform to channel our energies in order to achieve the change that the women in Iran so greatly deserve. I look forward to the day when I can address you from within Iran. I wish you all a very happy International Women's Day. Thank you.
خیلی خوشحال شدم فرزانه عزیز که دیدمت. با سلام و درود به تو، مثل همیشه فعال و پر انرژی. میخوام یه جمله بهت بگم که همه شهدایی که ازشون اسم بردی، از جمله عمه عزیزت و سایر فامیلات،
all of these martyrs you refer to, especially your dear aunt who was murdered by the mullah's agents in Iraq. And I'm sure you will be following their path. You who are representing Ashraf in your way, and I salute you. And
ستمدیده و تحت سرکوب
you are raising the voice of the repressed women and the voice of those children who have nothing to eat, who are sleeping in paper packing, who their problems have no answer other than bring down the mullahs. And this task is on the leading force. So all you young people who are determined, who want to bring down these mullahs, I salute you, and I'm sure your voice, your struggle finally will lead to results. Thank you very much.
با تشکر بسیار از فرزانه عزیز. Many thanks to dear Farzaneh. So happy to have you with us today. Now I will pass over the floor to Lady Valerie Corbett, women rights advocate and also a great friend of the Iranian resistance. Mrs. Corbett, please.
President-elect Maryam Rajavi, members of Parliament, distinguished speakers, PMI members, and especially the women of the Iranian resistance in Ashraf in Albania, following this conference on satellite TV or online. Thank you very much indeed for inviting me to speak on International Women's Day. It's a day that we mark the contribution made by women across the world, but particularly in Iran, to the cause of equal rights for women and for the eradication of gender-based violence, which continues to be a stain on our society. Today, I again wish for regime change in Iran, so it can be a country which respects cultural diversity, promotes gender equality, and encourages women, above all, to take their rightful place in society. As we've heard, the plight of women in Iran continues to be perilous, when through religious dogma, the mullahs crack down on the continuing protests throughout the country. Women, of course, are at the forefront of that conference. Sorry, I just again have a... women are at the forefront of those contests because they seek the freedom against restrictions about how they're allowed to dress, what they're allowed to say, and whom they can associate with. But despite the brutality of the regime, these non-violent protests work because they make the Iranian people far more resolute and resilient, and they need to be. So today I send this message from the free women of Britain to the women of Iran, particularly those in Albania. We regard you as the bravest of the brave, and we support your continuing struggle because when Mrs. Rajavi becomes president, Iranian women will stand beside men as equal citizens. So to all of you in Iran and Albania, know that we regard you as our sisters. We send you love and we support your right to be heard. Finally, I'm very proud to see the continued cross-party involvement of MPs and peers in the British Committee for Iran Freedom. I'm proud that you're continuing the legacy of my late husband, Robin Corbett, who founded the committee to support the people of Iran and the NCRI to bring about a free and democratic Iran. I have no doubt that Robin used to say when he ended his speeches, and I will say it too, Iran will be free.
Thank you very much, Lady Corbett, for your presence. I want to use this occasion and pay tribute to the memory of our dear Lord Corbett, his courage and his belief in freedom and democracy in Iran will be always remembered by the Iranian people. Thank you very much. Yes, Iran will be free.
Absolutely.
I also thank you very much, Lady Corbett. We are very happy to have you here today in our conference, and also thank you very much for your contribution. Now I welcome Mrs. Helen Williams, women rights activist from Wales. Please, Mrs. Williams.
Ladies and gentlemen, Madam Rajavi, thank you for inviting me to your conference. It's an honour to be amongst such distinguished company on International Women's Day. As we gather to celebrate women's social, economic, cultural and political achievements and increasing visibility in these areas, we must not forget that sadly, there are so many parts of the world where women struggle to achieve their most fundamental rights, let alone equality. The great country of Iran is sadly at the forefront of that inequality. I work in the charitable sector in Wales, empowering women and children. The very opposite to that is happening in Iran today. But on this special day, we remind the women of Iran that their struggle is not theirs alone, but the collective efforts of all of us who care about human rights. The panel today, with men and women representing divergent political views, different parties and none, different nationalities, backgrounds and professions, is a reflection of this collective action to promote equality and human rights. Any system of government which promotes misogyny and repression is doomed to fail. This is a historical fact. It is also evident, as we've been hearing today, that all too often women and some young juvenile women are prime victims of the regime, and yet they are in the forefront of the calls for change. The leadership of Maryam Rajavi represents progressive hope for the women of Iran. And I am certain that the day will come when the women of Iran are free, enjoying the same rights as men, and are able to represent and lead their country. The UK should support these brave Iranian women so that that day will come sooner rather than later. So we must challenge the regime on women's rights, call out inequality, and resolutely support the Iranian women's struggle for equality and a free and democratic Iran. Thank you.
Thank you for being with the Iranian women today and your support and your speech. This will further encourage the Iranian women in their path towards freedom. Thank you very much.
I also thank Mrs. Helen Williams for your contribution in our conference today. Our final speaker is Senator Erin McGrehan, member of the Irish Senate from Fine Gael Party. Please, Senator McGrehan.
Hello, I'm Senator Erin McGrehan. Happy International Women's Day. This is a message to you, the women of Iran. Stand tall, be confident. The women of the world stand with you. Iranian women have never surrendered to suppressive and misogynistic policies. You have formed a very resilient force right at the forefront for the fight for democratic change in Iran. I stand in solidarity and support the brave people and women of Iran and their resistance in their struggle for freedom, democracy and equality.
اگر اجازه بدین من چند جمله
If you allow me, it seems that we are reaching the end of the program. I would like to say a few points to dear brothers and sisters who are following this conference in different parts of the world. I see them all. I really thank every participant for standing with us for so many hours at this very late. And you know, still we were only able to refer to a small fraction of the problems of the Iranian people and especially the women of Iran. I'm hopeful for the day where all this pain can be answered. Dear sisters, dear parliamentarians and activists of women's rights, I am grateful for every one of you for your speeches, for your interventions, for women in Iran. I thank Baroness Wilma and Teresa Villiers for moderating. My sisters, every one of you who are defenders of women's rights who are here. I'm also grateful to the freedom-loving men who are defending women's rights for equal rights. I would like to stress and emphasize that the women of Iran who have stand up, they have the responsibility of change and the overthrowing of the mullahs and the emancipation of the Middle East and Iran from the evil of the mullahs. For freedom against Islamic fundamentalism, we need women in the lead. Brave mothers who are suffering, the girls, daughters who are part of the resistance units, all of them, yes, all of them need your active support, and I'm sure that the international solidarity on this day will bring the women of Iran, the people of Iran, they will have international solidarity backed by you all around the world. They will be able to overcome these evil, bloodthirsty mullahs and wipe it from the histories and also from the whole Middle East, and bring freedom and democracy for the Iranian people, and peace and stability for the region, and security and peace for the rest of the world. I'm grateful to you all. Thank you so much.
I also want to thank all of the guests and participants in our International Women's Day conference in these last days of the Iranian year, which happens to be also the last year of the century. We pray the new Iranian year will be end of the coronavirus and also the Velayat Faqih virus. Thank you all for your presence in our conference today. And also, once again, I thank our two co-chairs, Baroness Verma and also Honorable Teresa Villiers. Thank you very much all.